Chapter 505. Just a normal priest? Dake's tone was as calm as ever. But neither Aaron Leeds nor Aviva Julius could take it lightly. Ever since they first met at the Horseshoe Tavern, this 13-year-old boy had shown a temperament and wisdom far beyond his age. Especially those two difficult questions, they were a great shock to them. The reason Aaron Leeds and Aviva Julius came to him was because they subconsciously treated him as the head of the family in this Duke's mansion. But Dake Dimming obviously had no intention of helping them. Not only did he not want to help them, he even showed an attitude of holding them accountable. In the end, their relationship with Dake was not good in the first place. Looking for Dark was the result of him desperately trying to find a doctor. After all, the Church of Knowledge was just a small church. They could not find any other saving grace. Remember the URL. MVIP, can't you? VIP Aaron Leeds said carefully. Even if they are not normal priests, they only want to pursue the truth. Dake looked at him. You are a magus. Don't you know that copying historical figures is a taboo among taboos? Aaron Leeds sighed. I know, so I don't agree with it. Leeds did express his objection. Aviva Julius suddenly looked up and said, but our church is actually a relatively loose organization. The 13 elders each have their own opinions, and only reach a consensus on the pursuit of knowledge. So we usually use a voting system when deciding on a matter. If more than half 7 people vote in favor, we can get permission to execute. 7 people. Didn't you say that only 6 were caught? Dake was puzzled. Aviva Julius said in a low voice, one of them didn't come. Dake. A traitor in the group? At this point in the conversation, there seemed to be a small singularity. After Aaron Leeds and Aviva Julius learned that the 6 elders were caught, they rushed to the Duke's mansion as quickly as possible. So although they were aware of this, they did not think too deeply about it. Now that he thought about it, he suddenly realized that the whole situation was as simple as it seemed. Dake thought for a moment and said with a strange expression, could it be that you were reported by your own people? If that was the case, the missing logic from before would be straightened out. In fact, although the Church of Knowledge had posed a threat to Dake, after an investigation, it would be found that it was completely Ignatzu Cooper's personal behavior. Dake didn't have a bad impression of this church that taught poor children how to read and write for free. Otherwise, he wouldn't have talked to the 2 elders in front of him so calmly. Presumably, Yelvet was the same. If it wasn't for someone reporting them, perhaps very few people would pay attention to such a seemingly harmless little cult. Dake's eyes were filled with mockery. I didn't expect that even a small cult like this would have internal strife. Although Aaron Leeds and Aviva Julius did not admit it, judging from their expressions, it was very likely that they were BAs. Dake smiled and said, I personally think that instead of pleading with me here, why don't you think about what kind of person he is? After he reported half of the elders to prison, what can he get in return? Aaron Leeds and Aviva Julius were clearly aware of something, but they didn't seem to want to say much in front of outsiders. Of course, this was also human nature. But the melon was right in front of them, so how could they not eat it? So Dake persuaded. If you can reveal some inside information, I might be able to help you. What do you think? After hearing this, Aaron Leeds and Aviva Julius looked at each other, and seemed to have reached a consensus. After that, Aaron Leeds finally spoke. Mercury Hull is his name. At the beginning of the year, he replaced the seriously ill Isaac Bradley, and became the 13th elder. Mercury Hull, Isaac Bradley. Who are these people? Dake secretly rolled his eyes, but he quickly sorted out his thoughts. Isaac Bradley was once one of the 13 elders of the Church of Knowledge. But the elders of the Church of Knowledge seemed to be old people. Although this was in line with the impression of being knowledgeable, it would also bring some inevitable trouble. Once a person was old, all kinds of problems would arise. His body might suddenly collapse at any time. Isaac Bradley was just like that. After the new year, he suddenly fell ill, and then his physical condition deteriorated all the way until he could not get up again. Before resigning from the position of elder, he introduced Mercury Hull to the church, an elder with no faults to pick out from his resume. With his own erudition and gentle temperament, Mercury Hull was quickly accepted by the other elders. However, Aaron Leeds and Aviva Julius never expected that Mercury Hull would stab the order in the back at such a crucial moment. They were puzzled by this behavior, but according to the current evidence, the person who stabbed the church in the back could only be him. Dake and the two elders talked about Mercury Hull for almost half an hour, but in the end, they still could not find the motive for Mercury Hull to stab the Church of Knowledge in the back. According to the description of Aaron Leeds and Aviva Julius, Mercury Hull was knowledgeable and wise, elegant and kind, and was not a person who would do such a thing. And from the standpoint of maintaining the security of the king's city, even if Mercury Hull was the one who reported it, he could only be praised and not be held accountable. So this matter could only be put to rest for the time being. Dake would not only listen to the words of one side. When Aaron Leeds and Aviva Julius still wanted to plead for the few people who were arrested, Dake directly confessed, "I will go and understand the situation, but it will need to be tomorrow night." Tomorrow night was a boundary. Everything had to wait until the Demon King execution ceremony was over. After Aaron Leeds and Aviva Julius calmly thought about it, they could only accept this result helplessly. Dake smiled slightly, raised his hand and said, "Then both of you good night." After sending the two elders of the Church of Knowledge away, Dake said to Eve, who was beside him, "Find someone to follow them." Eve immediately nodded and quickly disappeared into the shadows. Although many of the maids of the Scorpio Palace maid squad had been transferred away, there were still enough maids in the mansion. Eve and Aaron could be regarded as the personal disciples of Scorpio Chris, and their status was second only to Chris as the head maid. They had always had the temporary transfer authority when Chris was not around. As Aaron Leeds and Aviva Julius left the Duke's mansion, two maids of the Scorpio Palace who were proficient in stealth followed them silently. In addition to following and investigating, they would also protect the safety of these two to a certain extent. Dake had a vague feeling that the incident of the Church of Knowledge this time might not be as simple as it seemed on the surface. After the deployment was completed, he leaned back in his chair and said to Olga, who was standing beside him, "Sister Olga, what do you think?" Olga slightly curled the corner of her mouth and said, "Although I don't know what method the people of the Church of Knowledge want to use, not to mention summoning the souls of great historical figures back to the world, even if it is just any random person, as long as it is a violation of the law of life and death. This is why the necromancers of the past were not welcomed by the people. This is the same reason why it is not allowed to use magic refinement to replicate the human species that existed in history. No one wants to be unable to live in peace after death. Therefore, no matter what, those 6 so-called elders have committed a crime. Since they have committed a crime, they must pay the price for it." Dark nodded and said, "My thoughts are the same as well. But since there is a mole among them, we need to consider whether those 6 elders were induced by someone to do such a thing. Mercury Hull, this person must be paid special attention to." Olga asked, "Young master, do you think he is the one who induced the 6 elders of the Church of Knowledge?" Dake shook his head and said, "I'm not sure. I'm just raising this possibility. After this ceremony, have Chris investigate in depth. Since the matter has been laid out in front of us, we need to nip the possible danger in the bud." Olga said, "Then what happened tonight? Do we need to report to the Duke?" Dake thought for a moment and said, "There is no need to specifically report it. If she comes back, we can inform her in passing." Olga had a plan in mind. Dake reopened the book he had closed and looked at the pages in deep thought. The lights flickered and the shadows were mottled. The manor regained its tranquility. But this tranquility did not last long. When Dake came back to his senses, Eve had once again walked out of the shadows in the corner. He couldn't help but rub the space between his eyebrows and ask, "Another visitor?" Eve nodded solemnly. Dake sighed slightly. Normally, it is difficult to have even one visitor. Tonight, at this unsuitable time, they came one after another. "Who is it this time?" Eve pointed at the wall and released magic power from her fingertip. A lifelike projection appeared on the snow-white wall, on a street some distance away from the Duke's manor. The 2 new visitors who were heading straight towards the Duke's mansion were also stopped by the patrolling guards just like the last time. But with the matter of the 2 elders from the Church of Knowledge as a precedent, the guards did not immediately take action. The two sides faced each other with a distance of 4 to 5 meters, and the atmosphere gradually froze. Dake sized them up carefully. The two new visitors were wearing large cloaks. The brims of the cloaks were intentionally pulled down to cover half of their faces. Under the flickering light, even half of their faces were blurry, making it impossible to identify their specific features. Aaron, who was responsible for receiving information on the other end, could only hide far behind them. The two sides conversed softly. The smaller visitor took a step forward and took off the hood of her cloak. Her pitch-black hair cascaded down like a waterfall. Aaron knew how difficult it was to take care of such long hair. A trace of envy flashed in her eyes. Then one of the guards walked out. After exchanging a few words, he turned around and walked toward the visitor. Looking for young master again? The guard's request for instructions and Aaron's mutterings were transmitted into the Duke's manor through the consonance spell. Dake looked carefully and revealed a surprised expression. The visitor obviously noticed this and turned around with a familiar and delicate face. "Young master, who is this?" Ollie knitted her brows and asked. Dake said, "Ollie, I want to eat lamb." In the middle of the night, it wasn't easy to cook lamb without prior preparation. However, some of the cooked meat could be served after simple cooking. The maids who received the order worked quickly in the kitchen. "It's so late. Is Sir Duke back?" "No, I think it's young master." "Young master? Does young master need so much meat for supper?" "Yes, young master has a visitor." "That's even stranger, isn't it?" The maids were always good at adding color to their dull lives with gossip. The news of young master having a strange visitor with meat spread across half of the Duke's manor, as though it had grown wings. At this moment, the two visitors hadn't even entered the manor. When the young lady with pitch-black hair appeared at the entrance of the Duke's manor with her mother, Dake had already prepared a meat feast in the dining hall. Ollie stood behind young master with a strange expression and asked a few times, "Is this really okay? Won't the guests be frightened?" "Don't worry." Dake waved his hand. Senior sister isn't a stickler for formalities. Milk tea, fried chicken, and barbecued meat. But in this world, there were always people who wouldn't get fat no matter how much they ate. Panduola Doragon was one of them. "He didn't come out to pick me up." Panduola sized up the courtyard of the Duke's manor, and the corners of her eyes curled up slightly. Of course, the consonant spell couldn't escape her eyes. She knew that someone would be watching from the other side, and it would most likely be her adorable junior. She didn't treat Dake's invitation to her as a courtesy before she left the academy. Now that she was here, it would be her junior's fault if he, as the host, didn't come out to welcome her. Since her junior was in the wrong, she could establish a psychological advantage. When she met him, she would be able to look down on him. With this thought in mind, Panduola curled her lips as though she had caught his tail. "What are you thinking about?" The silver-haired beauty behind her asked softly. Panduola said calmly, "I'm thinking about how to rise to the top." "Rise to the top?" The silver-haired beauty, Hephaestus Doragon, couldn't help but chuckle. "What are you thinking about? This is called the way of getting along." "Mom, you don't understand," Panduola said coquettishly and quickened her pace. "Ladies, please come this way." The maid who came to welcome them led them to the second floor. Just this action alone made the people in the residence realize that the visitor this time was of a completely different status than the previous two. Panduola followed the maid to the dining room. The rich aroma of meat that had drifted into her nose made her widen her eyes. Then she revealed a grand smile. "All right, I forgive you. 2 and 1 4,000 plus." Chapter 506. The lights in the dining room were dim. On the table covered with a gorgeous tablecloth, there were plates of meat with different cooking methods. In particular, there was a small mountain of steak in the middle. The sauce dripped from the top to the bottom of the plate, emitting a strong aroma that made people salivate. Dark only glanced at it, and he felt his appetite surging crazily. He quickly restrained his appetite and patiently waited for Panduola to arrive. He was surprised by Panduola's visit, but he was also a bit happy. The Demon King execution ceremony was a big event that attracted anyone to the capital. If Panduola really did as she said and didn't stay on campus this summer, then this event was the reason she came to the capital. Similarly, maybe some of the school's professors would also come to the capital. Dake couldn't help but think of Professor Li and Professor Ka Zaire. He hadn't seen them in a long time, and he really missed them. Remember, https://mvip can't you? VIP. While he was thinking, he suddenly heard footsteps coming from afar. He couldn't help but look up at the door. The maid leading the way stopped at the entrance of the dining room. Panduola and Hephaestus walked into the dining room together. She looked past the small mountain of steak, and finally saw her junior that she hadn't seen in a long time. This time, she withdrew her smile that was gradually blooming and showed her reserved side. Senior. Dake smiled and took the initiative to get up from his seat. He walked around the table to greet her. He hadn't seen her for more than a month, but she didn't seem to have changed much. However, her expression was a lot more cheerful. This was probably because of the woman next to her. Dake had noticed some clues when he was at the school, but he didn't ask. Now it seemed that Panduola did find her family after the Christmas holiday. He just didn't know which of her relatives was this woman, who didn't seem to be of any age difference. With a trace of curiosity, Dake walked closer and greeted her. Good evening, Senior. Did you just arrive? That's not true. Panduola couldn't help but smile. When you visit someone's home, you have to buy some gifts, right? As she spoke, she stuffed a large parcel into Dake's hands. Dake received the gift with both hands and felt its weight. He asked curiously, "What's this?" Panduola smiled and said, "Easter egg models. I didn't expect these models to be sold in the city. I thought they were only sold in the arena." Dake's face darkened. "You've smoked too much. Why don't you let me handle it?" "I didn't smoke it." Panduola squinted and pulled Hephaestus over from behind. "Let me introduce you, Hephaestus Doragon, my mother." "Hello, Dark Diamond." Hephaestus took off the hood on her head and scattered her white hair that emitted a silver glow. Dake immediately sensed a very special aura from this silver-haired lady. However, he didn't ask any questions. Instead, he immediately shook her hand and said respectfully, "Hello, Aunt Hephaestus Doragon. I'm a first-year student of the Shungmalian Academy. I was fortunate enough to meet Senior in the library." Hephaestus winked at him, her long eyelashes trembling slightly. She smiled and said, "Panduola told me about you." "Really?" Dake awkwardly retracted his hand. However, he didn't move it. Even with his increased strength after opening 3 chakras, he couldn't move it at all. Another superwoman with superhuman strength. Didn't they say that all girls were weak? Why were all the girls around him so strong? Where was Luosi? Where did Luosi go? Dake could only continue as if nothing had happened. "Auntie, I've prepared supper for you. Don't you want to try it?" Hephaestus turned to look at the table before letting go. "You're very considerate." He's always been very considerate. Panduola couldn't help but laugh. Dake turned around with a dark expression and said, "Do you two want cold drinks or hot drinks?" "Do you have cold drinks?" Panduola asked curiously. Dake said, "Of course we do. Ice black tea, ice lemon tea, ice milk tea. We have everything you want." "Ice lemon tea then. It's appetizing." Panduola naturally followed Dake over. Olga pulled a chair away from the table and moved the plate that was originally placed opposite her to Dake's side. Then she took out some ice from the icebox and placed it in a cup. She then poured in the lemon tea and shook it. Panduola and Hephaestus sat down one after the other. Dake didn't hesitate to fork the steak into Panduola's plate and said with a smile, "Don't be shy. Eat more." Back in the academy, Dake already knew that Panduola was purely a carnivore. However, there were so many people watching in the academy's cafeteria that he restrained himself. Now that he was at home, there was no need to restrain himself. To be honest, he really wanted to hold a Who's the Big Eater competition to see who had a bigger appetite between Deanna and Panduola. Well, perhaps little Nora also had the qualifications to join in the competition. Speaking of Nora, Dake said softly, "Inform Miss Montier Folly." Olga walked out of the cafeteria and informed the maid at the door. Speaking of which, since Panduola and his mother were visiting late at night, it was only natural that they would be staying at the Duke's residence. Dake had already asked someone to prepare a bedroom, but he didn't know how long they would be staying. However, since they were going to stay in the residence, he naturally had to introduce them to the others in the residence. Yvette and Claire weren't there, so the next ones were headmaid Jasmine and Nora. After that, Dake and Panduola began to talk softly. While the two young people were talking softly, Hephaestus Doragon, who was the older one, didn't disturb them. She just elegantly wiped out the meat on the table. As a pure-blooded dragon, even in human form, she had a bottomless stomach. Hephaestus was quite satisfied with Dake's family background. People who weren't rich enough couldn't afford to raise their daughters. Although her daughter didn't need a man to raise her, there were always times when it was inconvenient for a girl. Sometimes, when she was tired, she would want to lie down. Having a boy who could help her lie down was very important. Of course, she wouldn't give up her daughter just because of family background. If one wanted to snatch the treasure from the hands of a dragon, one needed more than courage. Just as the atmosphere in the cafeteria was heating up, Aurora Montierfali walked in from the corridor. When she received the maid's notice, she was actually a little surprised. But on second thought, Dake actually told her that a guest was visiting. Didn't that mean that she was family by default? Not a guest, but family. A trace of sweetness floated in her heart. Thus, she quickly changed into a relatively formal set of home clothes and came to the cafeteria. This mood was maintained until she pushed open the door and entered. At that moment, she smelled the scent of a strong enemy. It's a dragon. Dragons and giants were two species that stood at the peak of the world. But a mountain couldn't have two tigers. Whether it was in legends or historical facts, the relationship between pure-blooded dragons and pure-blooded giants wasn't good. They were naturally hostile, but because of their living environment and other reasons, they rarely confronted each other head-on. They were two rare species that saw each other as imaginary enemies. Aurora slowed down at the door. Panduola and Dake's conversation came to an abrupt end. They instinctively turned to look at the door. Hephaestus, on the other hand, continued stuffing meat into her mouth while casually glancing at the door. Two dragons. Aurora suddenly slid back a step. The timid expression that always made people feel was completely gone. A trace of seriousness appeared in her eyes. Giants and elves and humans? Hephaestus' eyes flickered with a faint light. She saw through Aurora's facade with a glance. A sun-chasing giant moon elf and human hybrid. Interesting. The atmosphere in the cafeteria instantly became tense. Dake narrowed his eyes and said, "This is my sister, Aurora." His interruption eased the atmosphere. Aurora's expression relaxed. She quickly walked forward with her fingers clenched. Soon, she sat down on Dake's right. Dake introduced her. "This is a fourth-year senior, Panduola. She will be a fifth-year senior in autumn." Then he turned to Panduola and said, "Aurora will enter the school in September. She has already received the admission notice in advance." Panduola sized up this Dake Diming's sister with great interest. She smiled and said, "Then you must be a first-year freshman. Let me introduce myself. I am Panduola Doragon. This is my mother. As senior, nice to meet you." Aurora hurriedly stood up and said, "I am Aurora Montierfali. Please take care of me in the future." Panduola looked at this somewhat familiar little sister and said, "The Shung Malian school is divided into different schools. If you are assigned to the magic school, just come and find me. By the way, you and Diana aren't relatives, are you?" Aurora was startled. Then she said, "Sister, do you know Deanna? She is my cousin." "Of course I know Deanna." Panduola put her hand to her lips and whispered, "Deanna and I often go to Traveler's Street without Dake's knowledge. Do you know Traveler's Street? It is a commercial street under the Shung Malian Academy. You can buy almost anything you want there. The supper there is delicious." Traveler's Street? There is such a place? Panduola sat down. Her eyes showed a trace of longing. Panduola smiled and said, "Many people think that the academy only has teaching buildings and dormitories before they enter the academy. But Shung Malian is not like that. There is everything you need to live there. After we enter the academy, we will stay in the academy for a full 9 months. But it is not boring." Aurora thought for a while and asked, "Is it like a small town?" "It is a little different." Panduola forked a piece of meat covered in sauce and waved it at her. "You will know after you enter the academy. If the academy's curriculum is not a burden for you, you will find a lot of good things. Aurora looked at Pandoola eating the meat in small bites. She swallowed a little and tried to control her appetite. She was always worried that she would become fat because of her appetite. With a giant's digestive ability, this bit of meat will only become nourishment for growth. Pandoola looked meaningfully at Aurora's neck and persuaded, "Aurora, you should eat more." Aurora could not help but lower her head. "But even if I don't become fat, I don't want to become as big as my mother." If Mayor Montefiore heard you say that, she would definitely cry, right? Listening to the two gradually become familiar with each other, Dake could not help but roll his eyes. "Senior Sister Pandora, are you trying to develop your offline?" He could already imagine the scene of a big eater leading two small eater kings to sweep through the night stalls in Traveler Street. In short, since Pandoola and Aurora were chatting, Dake could only change the subject of the conversation to Hephaestus Doragon. "Just call me Auntie." Hephaestus blinked at him. Her overly white face gave him the feeling that Pandoola had suddenly become mature. Hephaestus was like a mature copy of Pandoola. Whether it was in terms of appearance or personality, they were very similar. However, Dake, who was familiar with Pandoola, realized that his initial impression was completely wrong after chatting with Hephaestus for a while. Pandoola's extroversion sometimes gave people the feeling that she was forcing herself. The real her was actually a very introverted person. Her heart was so fragile that it was as if it would shatter like glass with a casual poke. She had always been using a steel-like shell to protect herself. Only a harmless person like Dake could make her carefully interact with him. Although she gradually became more cheerful after finding her mother, the soft nature of her heart did not change much. In comparison, Hephaestus was a person who was completely the same as what she appeared to be. Steel armor, steel claws, steel heart. After a short conversation, Dake knew that she was the type who would definitely get what she wanted. "Is this a dragon?" Dake's thoughts spun. Aaron and Eve had already told him that Hephaestus had the aura of a dragon species. Now it seemed like she was indeed a standard dragon. In that case, Pandoola was a hybrid of a dragon and a human. This also matched Dake's conjecture. After all, not many people could casually take out a dragon's reverse scale as a Christmas present. Come to think of it, that reverse scale was very likely shed by Pandoola herself. Dark's gaze involuntarily drifted toward his senior sister, who was smiling like a flower. He wondered where the reverse scale was on her body. But as soon as this thought crossed his mind, he suddenly realized how terrible his behavior of refining her reverse scale into a magic guide spirit was. Dake's face instantly turned pale. Although Pandoola most likely already knew that he was going to use the dragon's reverse scale to refine a magic guide spirit when he bought the white dragon ball from her, she knew that he was going to use it to refine a magic guide spirit. But knowing and seeing were two different things. "I can't let her know that I've really refined the reverse scale." As Dake spoke, he secretly made a mental note. Fortunately, he didn't show the young blue-eyed dragon in front of her. But his expression suddenly changed as he noticed that the magic guide spirits were gathering in this direction. It was time for supper. 2 and 1 4,000 plus yesterday. Chapter 507. When it came to the growth of their children, the Diamond family had always followed the policy of raising them with wealth. That was to say, rich education resources, rich learning time, rich basic necessities. Since returning to the Duke's mansion, Dake had assigned an exclusive maid to each of the magic guide fairies. Of course, that was not just for supervision. The maids would customize the clothes and food according to the preferences of each of the magic guide fairies. When the magic guide fairies were tired from studying, they would also provide additional relaxation services to help the magic guide fairies quickly recover their energy and improve their study efficiency. The supper every night was just an inconspicuous part of it. However, supper was of course not mandatory. Tonight was the night before the exam, so many magic guide fairies chose to continue studying. Those who came to eat supper and rest were basically the gluttonous magic guide fairies, such as Snorlax, the young green-eyed dragon, and so on. Yes, the young green-eyed dragon. The maid stuck half of her face out of the door of the restaurant, and looked at the young master at the dining table with an inquiring gaze. All right. Dake sighed slightly and nodded at her. Website. https://m. VIP can't you? VIP. Logically speaking, it was not good to let the magic guide fairies come to the restaurant for supper when there were guests. However, tonight's guests were somewhat special, so there was no need to be too reserved. After the maid received the young master's nod, she retreated outside the door. Immediately after, a group of maids carrying plates entered in a single file, filling up the magic guide fairy's table. Among them were vegetables, fruits, cakes, meat, milk, black tea, and other drinks. The magic guide fairies did not abstain from meat and vegetables, but their tastes were slightly different. For example, Meow Meow liked fish, Dream Demon liked sweets, Big Milk Pot liked vegetables, Vampire's Daughter did not like garlic, and so on. I have long wanted to ask, what is that table used for? Seeing the maids enter the restaurant one after another, Panduola could not help but ask. Dake hooked his finger at Panduola's familiar. The young winged dragon, who was holding a big chunk of meat and eating, flapped its wings and flew over, allowing Dake to tease its chin. He said, "That is the magic guide fairy's table." Just as he said that, the magic guide fairies that were meowing rushed in one after another. Pandora's thoughts moved, and she saw the young blue-eyed dragon among them at a glance. An idea flashed through her mind, and she said in surprise, "This can't be." Dake glanced at Hephaestus, who was beside Panduola, and hurriedly said, "That's right, this is a magic guide fairy refined using fusion factor and white dragon ball." The corners of Panduola's mouth curved upwards, but he didn't continue speaking. As for the young green-eyed dragon, after entering the restaurant, it also sensed something and subconsciously looked in her direction, its big round eyes sparkling like green gemstones. Panduola could not help but reach out his hand. The young blue-eyed dragon walked out from the group of magic elves with a puzzled expression. It repeatedly sized up Panduola and Hephaestus, who was beside her. Panduola and Hephaestus both had the same white dragon aura, so it couldn't really differentiate them. After seeing this white dragon, Hephaestus also said in surprise, "This is Dake's magic guide fairy?" Long ago, she had heard many stories about Dake from Panduola, and was especially interested in his magic guide fairy. The intelligence displayed by Panduola's young winged dragon made it impossible for her to doubt her daughter's words. She herself had just started learning magic guide techniques a month ago, and her understanding of magic gradually deepened, making her more and more curious about Dake's abilities. Of course, she also wanted to have a magic guide fairy with intelligence. It would be best if it was a white dragon baby with intelligence. That would be able to fill her maternal instincts that she had nowhere to vent for more than 10 years. And the young green smoke dragon that appeared in front of her was her ideal type. This is a young blue-eyed dragon. It was born 2 months ago. Dake still wanted to introduce the young blue-eyed dragon properly, but the latter had already arrived in front of Panduola and Hephaestus. It even considerately sat down so that it would not appear too tall. Panduola and Hephaestus each held one hand and stroked the young blue-eyed dragon's claws. The mother and daughter both had the same feeling of intimacy. After that, Panduola forked a large piece of steak from the table and fed it to the young blue-eyed dragon. The young blue-eyed dragon secretly glanced at Dake. Seeing that its master was only looking at it with a smile, it opened its mouth and bit into the tender and juicy steak, swallowing it with 2 slurps. Panduola, who had successfully fed it, immediately forked a second piece of steak. Hephaestus, on the other hand, poured a large cup of cold drink for it. Under the care of the 2 big sisters, the young blue-eyed dragon meowed happily. Gotcha! Little Snorlax, who was enjoying the feast, looked left and right. Suddenly, it waddled in front of Dake, biting its finger and looking up at him. Dake did not know whether to laugh or cry, so he also fed it the steak. But in this way, the rest of the magic guide elves could not stand it and surrounded them one by one. In the blink of an eye, Dake was surrounded by his own babies, who fed him one by one. But as he was feeding, he suddenly felt that something was wrong. When he raised his head again, he successfully met the young blue-eyed dragon's big, pitiful eyes. This baby dragon actually abandoned Panduola and Hephaestus and squeezed in as well. Dake could not help but look at Panduola and Hephaestus. He saw that his senior was unhappy, while Hephaestus had a helpless expression. And Aurora, who had witnessed the whole process, covered her mouth and laughed secretly. This kind of family comedy scene was always very good for her. Born in a single-parent family, and her mother was always busy with city construction, Panduola had no choice but to be sensible from a young age. Deep in her heart, she could not resist the warm family comedy. After supper time, the magic guide elves returned to their rooms under the supervision of the maids. Only Dake and the others were left in the dining hall. With this interlude, the group, who were finally familiar with each other, changed the topic and talked about the Demon King execution ceremony tomorrow. Panduola confessed, "Actually, it is not convenient for my mother to come into contact with the saint's sphere of influence, so I thought of bringing her to the Duke's mansion. The only place I can think of without the saint's informants is probably here." Dake nodded and said, "No problem, you can stay as long as you want. We don't have much in our mansion, but we have a lot of empty rooms. I have already instructed the maids to prepare rooms for you. If you are not satisfied with the location, you can change as you wish." Thinking about the time when Panduola found her mother, Dake had already guessed what Hephaestus had experienced. There was only one reason why a loving mother would not look for her daughter for such a long time, and that was because she could not find her daughter. Panduola was abandoned in the Forest of Exile since she was young. She endured the care of the exiles and the torment of the harsh environment. In the end, she witnessed the deaths of the people who cared about her. If she had not met Headmaster Aerdii and Miss Bella, her life would probably still be surrounded by despair and curses. But fortunately, she had met them in the end. Being brought to the Shungmalian Academy by Headmaster Aerdii was a turning point in her life. Since then, her luck had been good. During Christmas, she returned to the Forest of Exile to pay respects to the dead. But she happened to meet Hephaestus, who had rushed to the Forest of Exile as soon as she escaped. This changed her life once again. She began to have more expectations for the future. Dake did not allow his unnecessary curiosity to leak out. He did not mention anything about Bastia's prison break, and only assured her that the Duke's mansion was safe. But after that, he asked curiously, "Senior, do you want to watch the Demon King's execution ceremony?" Panduola said, "That's what I want to do. Aren't you going to watch it?" She thought that she could go with Dake. Dake winked at her and said, "I have a better way to watch it." "Watch it." Panduola recalled the word and couldn't help but laugh. "Tell me about it." Dake snapped his fingers. Eve and Aaron walked out of the shadows at the same time. Panduola wasn't surprised. Although her eyes weren't as powerful as Hephaestus' true dragon eyes, she could still see through some things. From the moment she entered the restaurant, she knew that Eve had been hiding in the shadows. Then Aaron also came in stealth. But after seeing the two of them, she rolled her eyes and realized that the twins should have a means of instant communication. Without waiting for her to ask, Dake said, "Aaron can be our eyes. We only need to watch from the Duke's residence. Besides, she's a professional lurker. Even if the Demon King's execution ceremony explodes, she'll be able to escape in time." Panduola keenly asked, "You think the Demon King's execution ceremony won't succeed?" They couldn't help but laugh. They might have other motives. Panduola pondered for a moment, and couldn't help but look at Hephaestus. Hephaestus nodded at her. She turned around and said, "Then isn't it meaningless to go there personally?" Dake said, "So why don't you watch it with us in the residence?" Since he had issued an invitation, Panduola had no reason to refuse. The two chatted for a while more, and reached a consensus. Watching from afar had too many advantages. Not only could they be far away from danger, but they could also watch and comment casually while eating. It was indeed much more comfortable. Even if an accident happened, it would be difficult for it to affect the residents through Aaron. Dake had always maintained a high degree of vigilance when it came to major events of this scale. Watching through a screen, he could better control his emotions and wouldn't lose control because of sudden events. This was the real reason why he thought of doing this. In short, with the addition of Panduola, watching the movie would be an additional experience. The large amount of meat on the dining table was unknowingly cleared away. Dake looked up at the clock on the wall, and found that it was already past 10. He said, "It's getting late. Senior, and Auntie must be tired from the journey. It's better to rest early. After you've rested enough, you'll be able to watch more comfortably tomorrow. Then I'll have to trouble you as the host, Hephaestus said. Panduola also stood up and said, then good night. Dake raised his hand and said, see you tomorrow morning. Thus, Panduola and Hephaestus were led to their respective rooms by the maid. Dake waited for them to leave before asking, how was it? Olga said, Lady Hephaestus is indeed a pure-blooded dragon. Miss Panduola also has dragon blood in her body. What about the other half? Dake asked curiously. Olga deliberated and said, it seems to be a human bloodline, but there seems to be something different. Dake nodded and said, to be able to bond with a pure-blooded dragon, she must be a human with a powerful bloodline. She might even be a saint. Aurora, do you see anything? Aurora thought for a while and shook her head. I can't see anything else apart from dragon blood. Well, that's about it. Dake waved at Eve and Irene. The two sisters came to his side. Dake said, give the order to investigate Hephaestus Doragon. I want to know why she's locked up in Badia prison. Not exposing her didn't mean not understanding her. Although the Duke's residence was safe enough, unnecessary risks still had to be avoided. Investigating Hephaestus was the most responsible thing to do. Church of Knowledge, pure-blooded white dragons. They're all coming, Dake murmured. When he raised his head, his face was already glowing. So interesting. He had already met so many interesting people just by staying in the Duke's residence. Wouldn't it be wonderful when the big screen was open tomorrow? It would be much more interesting than watching a movie. Aurora, who was looking at him next to him, seemed to be infected by his enthusiasm. Her eyes were shining. Olga also said excitedly, we should be able to see a lot of subhumans tomorrow, right? Like cat people and rabbit people? Cat people and rabbit people? Dake couldn't help but scratch his hands. Fortunately, his young master was smart enough to choose to watch from afar. After giving out all the instructions, Dake finally returned to his room. He looked around after entering the room. Except for little Snorlax, all the magic elves were working hard. This scene was like the night before the college entrance exam. He couldn't help but feel gratified. As for little Snorlax, maybe I should create an extra incentive for it. For example, I should first reduce the standard of 100 kilograms of food to 50 kilograms, and then increase the amount of food according to its performance. Thinking about such things, Dake got into bed after washing up. But he didn't sleep. Instead, he waited quietly. He didn't close his eyes until Olga knocked on the door and came in to tell him that Yvette and Claire had returned safely. The night was silent. When he opened his eyes again, except for Fairy Ibu, who was wearing the victory headband, even the Dilu beast had returned to its small bed to rest. The Dilu beast's actions were clearly rational, but Dake liked Fairy Ibu's drive. He walked over and hugged it, then said, go to the card and sleep for a while. I'll let you out in an hour. Me, Fairy Ibu rubbed against his cheek while wrapping its ribbon tentacles around his hand. After Dake knew that it agreed, he put it back into the magic card. Magic elves could enter a dormant state at any time in the magic card. That was equivalent to deep sleep, and their energy would recover faster. At this time, he turned his head to look at the window. The sun in the east was shining with golden light, illuminating the curtains covered with exquisite patterns. July 15th morning. 2 and 14100 plus yesterday. Updated at 12 o'clock p.m. Stand up. Guess how many words it can write? 4,000 guaranteed, 6,000 encourage, 8,000 flip, 10,000 perfect people, 12,000 shocking explosion plus infinity. Chapter 508. A day in the capital started in the wee hours of the morning. Cleaners were already walking around the empty streets. People in various shops were already preparing to open for business early in the morning. Drinkers who stayed up all night walked unsteadily in the alleys, finally unable to support themselves, and slid to the ground against the wall. Homeless people who lived in the corners of the city felt the faint light and opened their eyes in response, rolling up their belongings to hide in darker corners. The bronze bell of the magnificent Holy Cathedral rang at 5 o'clock in the morning. The monks and nuns in the cathedral woke up early and washed up, then began to work as usual. Although the church had publicly announced the Demon King execution ceremony, the staff working in the church did not receive any notice from the higher-ups. It seemed that the ceremony had nothing to do with them. Standing on the surface, they obviously could not understand the depth of the Holy Church. And today's ceremony venue was not in the Holy Cathedral. Remember the website, MVIP can't you? VIP St. Louis Square. The area of the Holy Church's jurisdiction second only to the King's Square. The Knights of the Holy Church had surrounded the square at dusk yesterday. Then, after just one night, a towering building was erected on the square. Four huge pillars of more than 15 meters high stood in the center of the square. With these 4 pillars as the foundation, 5 meters high walls surrounded the square on all sides. Each wall was carved with exquisite murals and mysterious runes. Only the front of the wall had a flight of stairs made of huge rocks, and on both sides were slightly thinner totem poles. On the second floor, there was a white jade altar carved with a magic array, and a blood-like liquid slowly flowed in it. On the 8 corners of the altar, there were 8 gems emitting magic waves. Now the magic array had not been activated, but there was already a strange aura spreading. It looked like it was true. 6 o'clock sharp. The Holy Knights wearing bronze and silver armor completed the handover with the Night Watch Knights, and the St. Louis Square gradually became more lively. The energetic Holy Knights were divided into rows and arranged in 4 directions of the square. The bronze-armored knights guarded the edge of the square, 3 knights in a group, and there was a distance of 3 meters between each group. The inner circle with the altar as the center was guarded by the silver-armored knights. The silver-armored knights were in groups of 2, and the distance between each group was only 1 meter, forming a square formation. 7 o'clock sharp. Priests in snow-white robes began to enter. They passed through the gaps between the copper-armored knights and entered the inner circle of the silver-armored knights. After that, some of the priests entered the building with the 4 pillars, while others stayed outside and prayed with their eyes closed. As the melodious sounds of prayer gradually rang out, the hands of the priests lit up with a faint white light. Gradually, a dense holy aura spread out. As for the residents and outsiders of the royal capital, they had already set off. Looking down from the sky, one could see that tens of thousands of people were like ants, walking along the streets that extended in all directions towards St. Louis Square. Although the Demon King execution ceremony was set to be held at noon, when the sun was at its brightest, people obviously couldn't wait until then. Before 8 o'clock, the surroundings of St. Louis Square were already filled with people. Merchants who sensed the business opportunity walked among the crowd, shouting and selling all kinds of convenient food and souvenirs. Some of them even printed Demon King execution ceremony commemorative cards, or the corresponding commemorative badges, which aroused the interest of many people. Unavoidably, conflicts arose frequently due to differences in race, culture, and temperament. But the Knights of the Holy Church turned a blind eye to this. The copper-armored knights standing at the edge of St. Louis Square were covered in armor, revealing only pairs of bright eyes. Their backs were ramrod straight, and they were full of energy. Long swords hung at their waists and spears in their hands. In the Duke's mansion, Dake, who had finished washing up before 6 o'clock, put Ibby the fairy back into the magic card and didn't do his usual morning exercise. He crouched in the dining hall with a strange feeling in his heart. Then, as expected, not long after, Arvette and Claire entered the dining hall. Dake, who had successfully crouched in front of his target, couldn't help but smile. "Baby, so early today?" Arvette walked in front of Dake and skillfully hugged him. Dake didn't struggle out of her embrace, but let her hug him. He then whispered, "Mom, be careful." Arvette was slightly startled, then smiled. "Of course I will be careful. Don't wander around at home." "Okay." Dake nodded. Another reason he chose to stay in the Duke's mansion was to not cause any additional trouble for Arvette. The Holy Church's foundation couldn't be underestimated. After more than 10 years of technological explosion, no one knew what kind of strength they were hiding now. Similarly, the remnants of the demon race and the evil church who dared to stand out during this special period wouldn't be good people either. Dake didn't forget the scene of destruction he saw in the maze of the Star Palace. If it was really a prophecy, then the most likely time he would encounter danger during this summer vacation was undoubtedly today. The flames spurting out from under my feet indicate that I'm about to step into danger, and the flames themselves indicate that this might be a fire-related disaster. Then the easiest way to eliminate it is to shrink back into the soles of my feet when I see the flames. An iron-headed person might be able to succeed for a moment, but only a cautious person can go further. Even if the sky falls today, I won't step out of the Duke's mansion, Dake thought to himself. He struggled to raise his head from the soft embrace, then said, "By the way, Mom, 2 groups of guests came last night." "I already know." Arvette buried her head in her precious son's neck and shoulder, absorbing Dake's factor to her heart's content. After a long while, she took a deep breath and raised her head. Her cheeks were slightly red. "The replenishment is over. Mom will definitely be careful. Don't worry." Dake nodded. "Then let's eat first." But when Arvette let go of him, Claire took advantage of the opportunity and hugged him, shouting, "It's my turn, it's my turn." Then, Dake was once again surrounded by mountains. Arvette and Claire ate very quickly. It was as if they had just sat down, then stood up again, and hurriedly walked out of the dining hall. Dake looked at their hurried backs and couldn't help but smile helplessly. Reincarnated into such a world, as the son of Yalvet St. Diamond, it was too much of a blessing. "Young master," Olga whispered. Dake replied, "Yes." Olga's voice had a hint of anticipation. "Can I do it too, Dake?" The next moment, he was once again surrounded by mountains. Today's Dake factor was also a hot seller in Tangtang. Dake only ate a little and picked up the newspaper to read. As expected, whether it was this morning's newspaper or yesterday's, it was wantonly announcing this Demon King execution ceremony. All kinds of experts appeared one after another, and scrambled to interpret the meaning of this Demon King execution ceremony, from various angles. There were also people who questioned the Demon King execution ceremony, and mocked the scholars of the Holy Church, rendering the entire event as the biggest joke in the world. Among them, the Clown Daily mocked it the most. The newspaper even made an exception and published 3 consecutive articles in the morning, afternoon, and evening. It was as if they wanted to ride on the popularity of this event and soar into the clouds. They really have the guts to say this. I wonder who the backer of this Clown Daily is? Dake only glanced at the words in the newspaper and couldn't bear to look at it. After mocking the Holy Church's scholar Abel Yerkes, this time, the Clown Daily even pointed at the Pope and criticized the famous Pope. The entire newspaper was filled with gossip from God knows where. Especially those reports that seemed ridiculous, but after reading them and thinking about it again, they felt like it was true. People couldn't help but think in that direction. It was very special. Maybe I can subscribe to another newspaper in the future. But it had to be said that the Clown Daily attracted Dake's fans. After he laughed happily, he put down the Clown Daily and picked up the most authoritative Great Sage Daily. Because it was a morning newspaper, the Great Sage Daily usually focused on the events that happened yesterday. But today's headline was unsurprisingly about the Demon King execution ceremony that was going to be held today. Compared to the Clown Daily, that deliberately created a funny style, the Great Sage Daily was undoubtedly very official. The headline of today's newspaper was on the necessity of the Holy Church's execution of the Demon King. The article threw the authenticity of the Demon King execution ceremony to the back of its mind and simply explained and analyzed the meaning of the Demon King execution ceremony. In the end, the conclusion was that it was completely unnecessary. Just this argument alone attracted Dake's attention. He looked at it carefully. The author's analysis angle was very strange but also quite interesting. He believed that continuing to seal the Demon King instead of executing him on the spot was beneficial to maintaining order. As long as the Demon King was alive, the remnants of the demon race would continue to focus on rescuing him from the Holy Church. In that case, most of the pressure from the remnants of the demon race would be shouldered by the Holy Church. And with the Holy Church's ability, they would naturally be able to bear it. But if the Demon King was officially executed, the remnants of the demon race wouldn't have a highly concentrated target, and the threat they brought would be scattered. There would be a lot of bad things happening all over the world because of this. This was equivalent to spreading the pressure of the Holy Church to all of humanity, which would cause social order to worsen. After Dake finished reading the entire article, he didn't agree with the content of the article, but he felt that it made sense. Then he thought about it, and felt that something was wrong. While he was in a dilemma, he remembered the author's pen name, Feather Crow. 7 o'clock in the morning. After Dake finished reading all the newspapers, he got up from his seat and summoned Fairy Evie again. He hugged it and said good luck, before letting it return to its room. Fairy Evie held its head high and puffed out its chest. It was very energetic and had an expression that said, "Who else but me can be number one?" Dake couldn't help but smile. He waited for a while longer before the 3 tutors from the Duke's mansion arrived one after another. Dake sat in the main seat of the dining hall, and supported his chin with his hand as he chatted with the 3 tutors about the exam, and mentioned the Demon King execution ceremony. Silent Sage Buckner Cyrus, who was a magister, and Ms. Barty Plant, who was a magician, were very interested in the Demon King execution ceremony. Only Ms. Monica Cook wasn't interested in it at all. Therefore, the 3 tutors allocated time to invigilate the exam according to the time of the ceremony. Cyrus and Plant were in charge of the 1st and 4th rounds, while Ms. Cook was in charge of the 2nd and 3rd rounds. In this way, Sage Cyrus and Ms. Plant were able to take time out to watch the ceremony. In fact, there were many people in the Duke's mansion who were interested in this event. Dark also invited Headmaid Jasmine, Headmaid Vago of the Maid group, and Headmaid Janice of the Pisces Maid group. After all, it was better to have fun together than to have fun alone. Other than Jasmine, who declined the invitation, the other 2 headmaids agreed. After the 3 tutors left as if they were deliberately avoiding them, Aurora and Panduola finally arrived. Dake picked up his cutlery and joined them for breakfast. "How was it? Did you sleep well last night?" "It was okay. This is the biggest bed I've ever slept on. It's just a little too spacious." Panduola winked at Dake and skillfully cut the steak for the day. "I don't know why, but I feel at ease here." Hephaestus also sighed slightly. Her expression was obviously more relaxed than yesterday. Obviously, after this night, she felt more at ease with the Duke's mansion, or rather, with Dake as a person. After escaping from prison, she didn't have a good time. From the beginning to the end, the Holy Church didn't give up on capturing the escapees and bringing them back for trial. In the process of escaping from prison, she realized that she was completely behind the times, so she didn't choose to fight force with force. Although she didn't show any worry in front of her daughter, it was only to let her daughter have peace of mind to study. Before Panduola went on vacation, she had been hiding in the Forest of Exile, and was very careful with her actions afterward. Yesterday, when she had transformed into her original form and flown to the capital, she had indeed used a spell to cover her tracks. However, she had still been seen through by Didi, who was a little fairy. At that time she had been truly shocked. Fortunately, the Holy Church had put most of their energy into the execution ceremony. Not only did she have a good time walking around the imperial city, she also successfully found the Duke's mansion. Fortunately, the young master of the Duke's mansion was exactly the same as what her daughter said. At first, she thought that the junior in her daughter's words was the product of a filter. However, after interacting with him personally, she realized that her daughter's judgment of people was really good. Her daughter's junior wasn't bad. He was just a little too young. Aurora also said to Panduola, "Senior, if it's inconvenient to say anything, you can tell me." Panduola was quite fond of this future junior, and chatted with her softly. After that, the magic elves lined up and were brought to the examination hall after breakfast. Dake and the others left together, and came to the living room where all kinds of melon seeds, fruits, pastries, and drinks were already prepared. Eve. After sitting down on the sofa, Dake looked at the corner of the wall. Eve walked out from the shadows with a focused look on her face. Dake asked, "Has Irene arrived?" Eve nodded and said, "She arrived at the periphery of St. Louis Square half an hour ago and is now waiting in the shadows." "In the shadows?" Dake thought for a moment and said, "Let her move freely. I also want to look around." Eve immediately obeyed and said, "Yes, young master. Today, Irene and I will be your eyes. Dake nodded, pointed to the chair in front of him, and said, "Have a seat. Don't be too reserved." "Yes, young master." Eve revealed a sweet smile and sat down as ordered. Then, she stretched out her hand and pointed at the snow-white wall. A super clear image appeared on it. Irene seemed to be hiding in the corner between the eaves and the wall on the second floor. Her vision was excellent, and she could see the entire St. Louis Square at a glance. Tall pillars, mysterious altars, neat rows of holy knights, and snow-white priestesses praying with their eyes closed. This scene was as sacred as a fantasy. But in the blink of an eye, Irene shifted her position. The image on the wall shifted to a small, enclosed room. Irene emerged from the corner of the room, tidied her bangs, and pushed open the door. At that moment, noisy noises squeezed into her ears and an extremely lively scene greeted her eyes. "This is the second floor of the tea house south of St. Louis Square." Eve spoke as though she was dubbing over the dialogue outside the venue. St. Louis Square is under the jurisdiction of the Holy Church and pubs aren't allowed to open around it. But merchants are always able to find business opportunities between the cracks. The Holy Church didn't forbid the sale of alcohol in the tea house. Dake blinked and gazed at the projection on the wall. Indeed, this place named Tea House sold alcohol openly. A refined orc held a wine glass and observed the flow of people outside the window. A hot-tempered elf pointed at a cowardly dwarf and scolded him. A goblin riding on a magic statue faced a small mirror in the statue's hand and tidied up 3 strands of his bangs. After Irene walked out of the small room, she sat down by the window. It was impossible for this seat to be reserved, but she paid a huge deposit in advance. Of course, the owner of the tea house wouldn't reject money, so he kept this seat. Irene activated the consonant spell. After sitting down, she took out a small bottle and stuffed a candy bean into her mouth. Feeling the accelerated recovery of her magic power and the sweetness of the beans, a rare smile appeared on her cold face. Suddenly, 100 flowers bloomed. She didn't have any intuitive feelings about being the young master's eyes, but there weren't many missions where she could move freely like today. Come to think of it, she was only a 14-year-old young lady who was passionate about going out. Irene rested her chin on her hand and gazed out the window. The warm breeze fluttered her bangs. There were still 4 hours before noon, but St. Louis Square was already crowded with people. If she didn't arrive 2 hours earlier, she wouldn't have been able to get such a good seat. Dake and the others witnessed the surging crowd through her vision. Even though there was a screen separating them, they still felt the heat wave blowing against their faces. Dark curiously observed everyone in the projection, and his gaze subconsciously fell on the subhumans. As the capital of the kingdom, the Holy Church existed in the King's City, and had always been unfriendly to the demi-humans. Therefore Dake Deming, who was born and lived in the King's City, rarely had the chance to see so many demi-humans. Even though he entered the Shungmalian Academy, the Shungmalian Academy was dominated by humans, after all, and there were basically no pure-blooded demi-humans in the academy. Even if there were demi-humans, most of them were mixed bloods. On such a special day like today, how could he live up to the sunflower seeds in his hand if he didn't watch the movie? Crack! Dake cracked open the sunflower seeds and his eyes glinted. "Stop!" Irene heard Dake's command through Eve's ears, and stopped moving her gaze immediately. Then, a beast man with long ears was projected on the wall. Apart from the pair of long, erect ears, the orc lady looked exactly like a human. As she wore a knee-length dress, her tail couldn't be seen. But it should be. "Is that a rabbit human?" Dake said in surprise. "It's a donkey." However, senior sister Pandora immediately interjected. Dake turned his head in shock, and Panduola couldn't help but laugh. But seeing him look over, Panduola quickly said, "The donkey's ears are indeed quite long. It's normal that you can't tell." Dake continued to look at the projection with a dark face. Irene's gaze moved along with it. Not long after, Dake's eyes glinted again, and he pointed at a fat orc and said, "This is an orc, right?" Panduola put a peeled orange on the fruit plate in front of him and said with a smile, "That's an elephant human." Dake looked carefully and said confidently, "Do you really think I'm that easy to fool? This orc doesn't have an elephant trunk." Panduola smiled and said, Don't you see the scab on its nose? That's because its trunk was cut off. Dake. Seeing that he really wanted to believe it, Irene pulled on his sleeve. Aurora tugged at his sleeve and whispered, "Senior sister is just teasing you." "That's really an orc." Dake blinked and said with a smile, "Aren't I just playing along with her?" Panduola was amused again. Sitting on the other side of the sofa, Hephaestus looked at her daughter's happy expression and couldn't help but shake her head. A grown daughter can't be kept at home. Just as she was thinking, her expression suddenly turned serious, and she said, "Stop." But the image on the wall flashed by, and when it turned back, the person she had noticed was already gone. "Aunt Hephaestus, did you see someone?" Dake asked seriously. Hephaestus said with a serious expression, "I wasn't paying attention to the wall just now." Dake said, "Can you tell me what kind of person that is? I'll get Irene to look for him." Hephaestus's eyes flickered, and then she shook her head and said, "No need. Whether that person is here or not has nothing to do with me. You can continue." Dake frowned slightly and said to Eve, "Tell Irene to pay more attention." "Got it." But Irene's voice sounded. Shortly after, she began to search for someone with an abnormal aura in the crowd below. However, right above her head, on the roof of the tea house, there was an old man with a benevolent face standing quietly. This elder wore a black priest robe with yellow edges. His hair was white, and his face was full of wrinkles. He wore a monocle on his left eye and held a thick scripture in his hand. The sun shone on the monocle and reflected white light. The elder lowered his head and looked at his feet, as though he could see Irene through the roof. "Is it the consonance spell? I thought it was the true dragon eyes." After confirming, he shook his head slightly and strode forward. Countless powerful beings came from all directions and couldn't be counted on the surface. After that, even though Irene paid attention, she didn't see that elder again. But Dake still got to know many famous figures through her perspective. There was no lack of demi-humans, but there were also plenty of powerful human beings. In the blink of an eye, more than half an hour had passed. Headmaid Vingo and Headmaid Jenny of the Pisces Palace maid team arrived one after another. The two headmaids wore the same maid attire, but the coat of arms on their chests were obviously different. Maid Vingo still had a formulaic smile on her face, which didn't give people a good feeling. Dake used to order her to remove that formulaic smile as the young master. But after Vingo stopped smiling, she put on an extremely stern and cold face. She was stern and even stricter than Professor Shi-Erfu, who purposely pulled a long face. Dake would never forget the painful time when she held a ruler and taught the noble etiquette. On the other hand, Pisces Jenny had the same thoughts. Her smile was natural and bright, and she was relatively casual. This morning, she wore exquisite makeup that looked like light makeup. Her wine-red hair, which was always tied up high, cascaded down casually, which made her look younger by a few years. She looked like she was in her early 20s. Perhaps no one would expect her to be an expert in fishing. The arrival of Vigo and Janice caused the living room to become livelier. Shortly after, Olga also sat down. Almost all of the permanent audience members had arrived. Vingo wasn't a talkative person, but Jenny was good with words and became familiar with Hephaestus after exchanging a few sentences. With these two peers around, Hephaestus was no longer lonely. The entire living room was divided into two groups according to their apparent age. Time passed quickly. After Dake had seen several demi-humans, he was about to let Aaron stand up and walk around. But as Aaron was about to stand up, someone approached her. She turned around slightly, and the appearance of the newcomers was projected on the wall of the living room. There were a total of 3 of them: a swordsman, a shield warrior, and a mage. It was a rather popular adventurer group. With the protection of the swordsman and shield warrior, the mage could summon magic cards to battle to her heart's content, and her efficiency was much higher than that of a mage or archer. Aaron knitted her brows after noticing their approach. However, Dark, who was watching the movie, had his eyes lit up. He said excitedly, "Has it finally appeared? That's the one, right?" "Which one?" Panduola asked curiously. Aurora said softly, "He might be referring to the nameless supporting characters that often appear in novels." "The nameless supporting characters?" Panduola came to a realization and said with a bitter smile, "That's just a novel after all." Dake said with a smile, "Art comes from life." Panduola shook his head and said, "What I mean is that they usually announce their names." Dake was baffled. "Miss, may I have the honor of sitting at the same table with you?" The archmage in black robes took off his hat in a very gentlemanly manner, revealing an elegant and easygoing face. The swordsman and shield warrior behind him didn't look ferocious either. Aaron swept a glance at them and said coldly, "No." The mage wasn't angry after being rejected. He put on his hat and stood up straight. But the swordsman behind him held his sword and sneered, "Miss, a table can seat 4 people. Including the 3 of us, it's not much. If it's a matter of money, we can go Dutch." The shield warrior also mumbled, "Don't use the excuse that there's someone else. The 3 of us have been observing from the side for a long time. You're alone, right?" But no matter what they said, Aaron only said one word, "No." And after saying that, she turned her gaze to the window and ignored them. The 3 adventurers looked at each other, and the mage in the middle persuaded again, "Miss, you don't go out often. The 3 of us are quite famous among the adventurers. I'm Bloodblade Mage Sammy. My swordsman brother is Storm Sword Yahweh, and my shield warrior brother is Unyielding Fortress Abby." When Sammy announced the names of the 3 adventurers, Storm Sword Yahweh and Unyielding Fortress Abby both held their heads high and puffed out their chests. Obviously, they were very satisfied with their names. They really announced their names? Dark couldn't help but take a bite of the apple. Then he asked doubtfully, "Are these 3 adventurers really famous?" But everyone in the living room shook their heads and the atmosphere was a little strange. After a few moments, Eve said, "I do know something about adventurers, but I've never heard of their names." "Is that so?" Dake estimated. "What are the chances of Aaron winning?" "A bunch of trash." Aaron's voice sounded. Dake widened his eyes. Indeed, the 3 adventurers were about to fly into a rage after hearing the word trash. Harmony is the most important thing when out in the world. "We're not here to fight today," Dake warned hurriedly. Although Aaron's face was filled with reluctance, she still forced out a sentence. "All right, girls." But Dake didn't stop there and continued, "So let's end this quickly." Aaron's eyes glinted. She attacked almost as soon as Dake's voice subsided. She moved her fingers swiftly and a wisp of black light shot out, transforming into a serpent in midair and biting Sammy's neck in the blink of an eye. That wasn't a spell, but also a spell. Each of her fingers was adorned with a set of fake nails. They were a set of magical tools and each fake nail had a unique function. The serpent transformed from the black light had paralyzing venom in its teeth that could knock down the strong orcs instantly. Not to mention the delicate archmage. The best way to deal with the archmage is to knock him down before he can summon his magic card. Aaron stood up unhurriedly. Since the most troublesome archmage had lost his battle ability, the remaining 2 warriors were no more than lambs waiting to be slaughtered. Frankly speaking, she had been cooped up in the mansion for a long time. Ever since Dake returned home for the holidays, had made Chrissy didn't assign new missions to the sisters for some reason. Her hands were so idle that they were about to explode. "Do you want to fight?" Aaron drew out her dagger and waved it at the swordsman. She realized that her young master might want to watch a martial arts scene. The swordsman wasn't cowardly. After the archmage collapsed, he didn't flee like a stray dog. Instead, he got the shield bearer to protect the archmage while he drew his sword at Aaron. The sword chime was clear and melodious. Almost all the customers on the 2nd floor of the tea house looked over with interest, and didn't have any intention of stopping the fight. Even the waiters of the tea house stepped back and peeked out half of their faces to peek. In this special period of time, the hunter would shoot the bird that poked its head out. Even the swordsman hesitated after drawing his sword. A glint flickered in Aaron's eyes and the dagger in her hand pierced out like a snake. She was afraid that Storm Sword Yahweh would cower if she was too slow. Wouldn't that spoil her young master's mood? Storm Sword Yahweh knew that he couldn't be kind when Aaron struck again. He no longer hesitated. His wrist that was holding the sword shook violently, and the blade trembled violently. Then violent ripples erupted from the blade and formed a terrifying storm in an instant. It was actually a demonic sword. But Erin merely curled the corner of her lips and pierced through the storm with her dagger, striking Yewei's wrist in the blink of an eye. SSSSS. The artery on his wrist was cut and blood gushed out. She leaned back, retracted her dagger to parry, and smacked the blade gently. The blade fell to the ground in a loud clang. Storm sword. Yewei clenched his wrist with a pale face, took 3 steps back, and turned around to flee. Don't forget your sword. Erin, on the other hand, tapped the tip of her toes and kicked the demonic sword at Yewei's buttocks. Duong. The shield-bearer who was holding the archmage stepped forward and blocked the sword with the round shield on his arm. Then, he grabbed the falling demonic sword and carried the archmage down the stairs with one hand. The swordsman, Yewei, followed closely behind and fled in a fluster. Erin heard the praises from her elder sister and couldn't help but smile. This is what I want. This small episode didn't cause too many changes. Dark was in a good mood after watching the fighting scenes. He praised Erin for a few minutes, which left Eve blushing in embarrassment. On the other hand, Erin returned to her seat and sipped her tea like an expert. After this, the surrounding guests all knew that the girl who occupied the entire table was no ordinary person. With no one around, Erin observed from the window for a while. Then, she followed Dake's suggestion and prepared to go out for a stroll. Of course, this wasn't the only tea house around St. Louis Square where one could rest. Erin strolled for half an hour and bought some food and souvenirs like an ordinary young lady. Then, she returned to the tea house. It was already 9:30 p.m., and there were only 2.5 hours left before the execution ceremony would begin at 12 p.m. sharp. Erin walked up to the second floor expectantly, only to realize that her seat wasn't occupied. She shook her head in disappointment and continued to observe. The view here was great and she could see St. Louis Square with just a slight turn. But from this morning until now, there weren't any changes. Those who should or shouldn't be here didn't appear. Is it because it's not time yet? Dake gazed at the gluttony +1 that floated before him and couldn't help but put down the fruit in his hand. But as soon as he put down the fruit, Panduola noticed that he was controlling his diet. She peeled off the skin of a grape with a smile, raised her hand, and stuffed it into his mouth. Dake's face darkened instantly, but the grape had already entered his stomach. But fortunately, the gluttony didn't continue to increase. He said with a stern face, "Senior sister, it's not good to feed others." "Can't I?" Panduola winked at him. Dake shook his head. "No." Panduola opened her mouth and said, "All right, feed me then." "Dake." Panduola. "Ah." Dake had no choice but to peel off the skin of the grape and stuff it into her mouth. On the other side, Aurora couldn't help but open her mouth halfway and move it symbolically. But then, Dake stuffed a grape into her mouth as well. A smile appeared on her face. Dake couldn't help but sigh. What did these girls eat when they were growing up? How could they be so cute? Dang 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 dang. As he was thinking, his ears suddenly pricked up, thinking that he was hallucinating. However, the projection on the wall really did show little Lili's face. The Sheng Malian trio, who had just come up from the first floor, looked around the second floor. Professor Kazair shook his head slightly. "Looks like there aren't any seats here." Professor Shi Erfu sighed. "I told you to come earlier." Lili turned his face away, indicating that he definitely wasn't holding them back. But just as the three were about to go downstairs, Little Li's eyes suddenly lit up and he said happily, "Look, is the child over there waving at us?" Professor Kazair turned his head and said, "I think so." Professor Shi Erfu frowned. One who is unaccountably solicitous is hiding evil intentions. Be careful. But before she finished speaking, Lili had already flown over. For all, hello. Good morning, Professor Lili. Irene was extremely respectful after learning the identities of the three people. You know me? Lili carefully sized up Irene's face and asked doubtfully, "But I've never seen you in the academy." "I'm not a student of the Sheng Malian Academy." Irene's eyes flashed and she shook her head. "I took the entrance test 2 years ago and failed. That's a pity." Lili sat down directly beside Irene without any reservations. Seeing this, Professor Kazair and Professor Shi Erfu had no choice but to sit down at the table. Eve smiled at the two of them. Professor Shi Erfu, Professor Ka Zaire, my young master wants us to send his regards. I've written a total of 14,000 words today. I'm asking for votes confidently akimbo. Keep up the good work. Try to write another word before noon tomorrow. Chapter 509. Your young master? Professor Shi Erfu couldn't help but feel confused. Erin tapped her finger lightly and used the consonant spell to create a projection on the table. Then, a familiar face appeared in front of everyone with a smile. Professor Shi Erfu understood and said, "Didn't Dimming come to watch this rare ceremony?" She was just asking Erin, but Dake directly said, "Erin did it for me, so I'm just taking a break." "Professor, is it just the three of you?" Professor Shi Erfu said. "Yes, we're mainly here to relax." Dake immediately invited them. Then after the ceremony, "Why don't you stay at my house for a few days?" Professor Shi Erfu smiled. "I can visit your house, but staying for a few days." "Of course." Lily squeezed into the screen and winked at Dake. Dake, have you finished writing the teaching materials we worked on together?" "Not yet. Actually, I just started writing 2 days ago," Dake said. "I need little Lily's supervision before I can start writing." "Then I'll definitely go." Lily looked at Professor Shi Erfu energetically as if saying, "Did you hear that?" Professor Shi Erfu frowned and said helplessly, "Then stay for 1 or 2 days. That's all." Okay, Lily agreed readily. "Anyway, just stay there first, right?" Professor Ka Zaire shook his head and said, "Dake, you didn't slack off during the holidays, did you?" Dake subconsciously leaned on the sofa and said lazily, "I'm still quite lazy." Professor Ka Zaire choked and couldn't help but laugh. "Have you learned the transformation spell?" "Not yet," Dake said. Professor Ka Zaire nodded. "Then I'll teach you." "Okay." Dake immediately smiled. His original plan was to wait until Claire was free before asking for advice. However, if Professor Ka Zaire came in person, then it would naturally be better for Ka Zaire to continue teaching. Professor Ka Zaire said with a smile, "Professor Pawacheongsi actually has a transformation club. If your transformation spell is good, I can recommend you." Dake shook his head. "But I've already decided to rebuild the Magical Animals Society." Professor Ka Zaire smiled and said, "Students can only join one club, but the club established by a professor is not included in this list." "Is that so?" Dake pondered. "I can consider it." As he spoke, Panduola squeezed past him into the screen. Shi Erfu said in surprise, "Isn't this Panduola? Is she with you too?" Panduola said, "Professor, I just arrived last night." Shi Erfu nodded and said, "It seems that you two have a good relationship." Happy moments were always short-lived. Dake only felt that they had chatted for a short while, but in the blink of an eye, half an hour had passed. When the clock struck 10 o'clock, there was finally some movement in St. Louis Square. "Is it finally starting?" Irene's gaze immediately turned to St. Louis Square, and the three professors also stopped talking. As if sensing the change in the atmosphere, the people in the tea house also walked to the window. At this moment, the sound of prayer that had been fluttering in St. Louis Square finally changed its tune, and a gilded carriage slowly came from the horizon. The bright carriage cut through the sky under the guidance of a pure white unicorn, and the wings of light on both sides of the carriage flapped and scattered light feathers at the same time. A sacred and solemn aura spread out along with the change in the sound of prayer. Following closely behind the gilded carriage were golden-armored holy knights in golden armor. Every golden-armored holy knight rode on their own personal mount, advancing neatly on the golden path that spread out along the way. Just like that, without any warning, the first batch of higher-ups of the Holy Church arrived at St. Louis Square. The gilded carriage pulled by the unicorn stopped outside the formation of the silver-armored holy knights. The person who pushed open the door of the carriage was a haggard old man dressed in a luxurious robe. His name was Caleb Norris, the chief archbishop of the Holy Church. The appearance of the chief archbishop excited the crowd outside the square. Some of the believers immediately shouted at the chief archbishop, and the atmosphere there was instantly heightened. In the living room of the Duke's mansion, Dake carefully sized up the chief archbishop, who was second only to the Pope in the Holy Church. Why do I feel like I've seen him somewhere before? Perhaps it was the fleeting glance during the duel that made Dake notice this chief archbishop, so he still had some impression of him. This is the chief archbishop of the Holy Church, Caleb Norris. Eve's voice let Dake know the identity of this old man. But Dake first thought about the previous chief archbishop, and he couldn't help but shake his head. Even in the Holy Church with concentrated beliefs, power struggles couldn't be avoided. But this chief archbishop is so old, so he shouldn't be able to participate in the competition for the next pope, right? Come to think of it, what was the current pope's identity before he became the pope? Dake's heart skipped a beat, and he voiced his doubts. It was apparent that Eve and Aaron had received training in this area, and they had a detailed understanding of the background of important figures. Before the others spoke, Eve continued, the current pope was once the holy son of the Holy Church and was known as the contemporary saint. He was the person closest to becoming a saint. The pope is also a saint? Dake's heart skipped a beat, and he couldn't help but ask. Compared to the low-profile chief archbishop, he was more familiar with the pope. But this was also the first time he learned that the pope was actually a saint. The so-called saint was a general term for special human beings who had awakened the divine bloodline. Elvet and Headmaster Erdii were both saints. They also received powerful strength and long lifespans as a result. But in Dake's impression, the pope was an elderly man who looked similar to the chief archbishop. This significant difference meant that there must be a secret behind it. But Eve didn't know much about such internal secrets. Instead, it was Hephaestus Dorogon who spoke. Although the pope is also a saint, he wasn't born a saint. Instead, he was man-made. In the Holy Church, it's also known as divine creation. Man-made? Divine creation? Dake couldn't help but frown. What's the difference between a natural saint and a man-made saint? Hephaestus spoke with assurance. Man-made saints are divided into different levels according to the level of the divine bloodline and the compatibility of the bloodline recipient. Only the highest level of man-made saints can reach the level of natural saints. And that's only limited to strength. Not only do they not receive a long lifespan like natural saints, but they will also have their lifespan reduced by forcefully implanting the divine bloodline into the human body. Therefore, the Pope of the Holy Church usually doesn't live long. Not long again. Dake couldn't help but roll his eyes. As the saying went, you gain something, you lose something. Creating a saint from humans was also within the category of alchemy. And alchemy was most particular about the principle of equivalent exchange. But the price of creating a saint from humans was far more than just a reduction in lifespan. But no one cared. In St. Louis Square, with the appearance of the chief archbishop, the Holy Church finally started to move. The golden-armored holy knights who came with the team formed an array around the four pillars, forming the innermost line of defense. The archbishop slowly walked up the giant stone stairs and came to the front of the altar. But just as people thought that he was going to make a big move, the archbishop knelt down in front of the altar, clasped his hands together, and began to pray like the priests. But as his prayer gradually grew louder, the precious jade on the corner of the altar lit up, and circles of magic waves were emitted from the altar. The magic seeped into the air, causing the surrounding environment to change subtly. When people reacted, the area within a radius of 5 kilometers with St. Louis Square, as the center was already covered by a layer of enchantment. Although this layer of enchantment only raised a light wall without any blocking effect at the edge of the 5 kilometers, it still caused a huge uproar. The people who happened to be near the edge instinctively fled after seeing the light wall, only to be shocked to discover that the enchantment seemed to be just a light effect. People were hesitant. Some decisively chose not to get involved in the muddy waters, while some entered and spread the news quickly. But shortly after, Aaron and the others in the tea house also learned about it. And since Aaron knew about it, so did Dake. He couldn't help but ask, is this Archbishop Caleb Norris doing some preparatory work? Professor Shierfa's expression turned slightly grim. Do you still remember the ritual venue we set up in the academy? Dake thought for a moment and said hurriedly, you mean the astral enchantment set up by Professor Midya? Professor Shierfa said in a deep voice, the most basic condition for ritual refinement is to create an environment suitable for the ritual. Caleb Norris is most likely adjusting the overall environment. Professor Kazair said in astonishment. Shi-Erfu, according to what you said, the Holy Church wants to perform the ritual refinement? Is this the execution method they thought of? Professor Shi-Erfu was silent for a moment. Who knows? Professor Kazair couldn't help but shut up and shake his head. After all, the Holy Church couldn't execute the Demon King, because they only had the shell of the Demon King's body. But what the Holy Church was doing now did seem like they were preparing for the ritual refinement. Maybe they have some other purpose? Kazair said. Wait, what other purpose? Little Lily was still confused after listening for a long time. Why can't I understand what you're saying at all? Did you forget to bring me along for some fun? Aha. Professor Kazair laughed dryly, thinking that they didn't bring him along either. In that case, Professor, Dake said worriedly, since the Holy Church might want to start the ritual refinement, shouldn't you leave the barrier now? Professor Kazair frowned slightly and said, That's true. There's no need to take unnecessary risks. But Professor Shi-Erfu shook his head and said, I want to continue watching. As for the ritual refinement, there's no need to worry. Then, she took out a magic card from her card bag and placed it face down in the middle of the table. Then, she pointed her finger at the magic card and chanted an incantation. 3 seconds later, the magic card was instantly activated. A circle of light that ordinary people couldn't see suddenly expanded and formed a ball with a diameter of about 3 meters, surrounding the 4 of them. The special factors that permeated the air were all pushed away by the ball, causing the area to be completely separated from the ritual environment. This is area prohibition. It can delimit an area that is not affected by the venue, barrier, and other factors. Professor Shi-Erfu said lightly. Almost at the same time, Archbishop Caleb Norris on the altar moved his eyebrows and opened his eyes slightly, but soon he closed them again and continued to maintain the operation of the barrier. There were many people who used the same kind of secret method to avoid the effects of the ritual. In his field of vision, bubbles were appearing one after another within the giant barrier with a radius of 10 miles. As for the people who had used the secret technique, they were all inside the bubble. There were quite a number of people, but compared to the crowd attracted by the Demon King execution ritual, it was only a small group that didn't cause any harm. But this small group couldn't be ignored. He only pursed his lips slightly, and the Holy Church's deployments in the crowd immediately understood the location of the bubbles. Then in groups of 3, they quietly approached the bubbles. They didn't come into contact with the bubbles. They only observed and recorded from a distance. Although the Holy Church seemed to be doing nothing, they had already started to act. The entire area within a radius of 10 miles was already filled with the Holy Church's spies. At this time, he used the side effect of the barrier to mark out some unidentifiable dangerous objects and monitor them in all aspects. However, his actions did not escape the observation of a portion of the crowd. After Professor Shi-Erfu activated the area restriction, he immediately found that he and the others were being watched. In fact, they had always been watched, but this time, there were more people. I see. This barrier has another function. Professor Shi-Erfu understood but didn't take any action. Surveillance is surveillance. I can't stop people from watching, right? She didn't care. Only Hephaestus in the living room was relieved. Fortunately, I didn't go. She patted her trembling heart, picked up the fruit, and took a bite. Her mouth was full of juice. With this level of surveillance, she was likely to be exposed in an instant. At that time, she would have to face the encirclement of the Holy Church again. The area around the entire St. Louis Square had subtle changes after the barrier was activated. Some people hurriedly retreated, some people were being watched, but there were still people who blended perfectly into the crowd and didn't show any trace of existence. Similarly, there were also people whose whereabouts were so secretive that even the Archbishop couldn't detect them. The entire ceremony developed rapidly with this as the foundation. After all, only a small portion of people retreated. Most people chose to continue watching, and there was a steady stream of newcomers entering the barrier. Under the silent influence of the barrier, people's emotions began to gradually change. above a small building located to the north of St. Louis Square. Arvette and Claire raised their glasses and drank with smiles on their faces. They gradually realized what the Holy Church wanted to do. 2 and 140 plus. About 10,000 more today, but it will be a little late. I have something to do during the day. Chapter 5:10. I didn't expect the Holy Church to come up with such an idea to fool the world. If we didn't know that the Devil King had escaped, I'm afraid even you and I would have been fooled. Yelvette put down her teacup and sighed. Claire closed her eyes slightly and raised her vision to the sky, looking down from a great height. In just a moment, she was able to clearly see everything within the 5-kilometer radius of the barrier. A huge amount of information poured into her brain in an instant, but with the help of the Beehive Brain Magic card, it was quickly organized into clear lines of information, and then digested and absorbed. Claire opened her eyes slightly and smiled. I have to say this is indeed a good method. Not only can we fool the Devil King into thinking that he had escaped, but we can also use this opportunity to clean up. Although the remnants of the Devil Clan are not enough, if they are given some time to develop. Yelvette nodded and said, the world is developing too fast, as if the progress of hundreds of years has been compressed into 10 years in an instant. If I didn't experience it personally, who would have imagined such a scene? Crisis and opportunity have always coexisted. Claire shook her head and sighed. It's better to believe in something than not. Whether or not we believe that the Holy Church can completely kill the Devil King, the remnants of the Devil Clan who regard the fact that the Devil King is still alive as the last straw will rush over like moths to a flame. Even if they are burned by the flames, they won't stop. Yelvette said, but in general, we need the Holy Church to really do something. Otherwise, if we can't fool people, we can only catch some small fish and shrimps. Claire smiled. But now it seems that they might be able to do a good job. Yelvette couldn't help but smile. I hope so. If we can really fish the crocodile out of the swamp, it will be more peaceful in the future. When the hour hand turned a full circle again, Archbishop Caleb Norris stopped chanting and slowly stood up from the edge of the altar. He had completed the adjustment of the ritual environment. Next, it was time to welcome the Pope. At such a historic moment, the Holy Church certainly couldn't send only one archbishop to preside over it. From the beginning, when they discovered that the Devil King had escaped to today's Devil King execution ceremony, they had experienced countless disputes that were unknown to outsiders. In fact, they were not fully prepared. However, the time for the plan had arrived, and he had no choice but to force it into action. Today's Demon King execution ceremony was a gamble with the fortune of the saint for the next 100 years. Failure was not an option. Archbishop Norris turned around and faced the crowd surrounding the square. After waiting for only 2 minutes, several golden carriages appeared in the sky again. Similarly, there were unicorns pulling the chariot and golden-armored holy knights guarding it. When the carriages landed one after another, the greatest existence of the Holy Church, Pope Francis St. Patricius, walked out from the carriage at the front. The Pope, who was only in his early 50s, looked like a doddering old man. However, when he raised his head, his aura, which was like a sharp sword that pierced through the clouds, caused his essence, energy, and spirit to change completely. He truly had the bearing of a pope. His eyes were cold, and he did not deliberately put on a loving expression. As she shifted her gaze to the Pope, Dake also saw him through the projection, and couldn't help but be captivated by the staff in his hand. That's the God's wrath? The staff was more than 2 meters long and looked like a rotten wood carving. There were branches extending from the top of the staff, firmly grasping a magic stone burning in green flames. That was the God's wrath. An old-era staff that could transform wrath into magical flames. Dake had been paying attention to the God's wrath for a long time, but he didn't expect to see it in the hands of the Pope. But wasn't the Pope's staff the Aldum staff that could enhance all magic spells? Dake revealed a trace of doubt in his eyes. The Aldum staff was a godly artifact and was the status symbol of the past popes. Whenever the popes appeared in public, they would always be holding the Aldum staff, and there were no exceptions. It can't be damaged or lost, right? Dark couldn't help but ponder. While he lowered his head and pondered, Erin shifted her gaze to the other carriages. There were only 10 people who came with the Pope. Even if the Pope and the Chief Archbishop were included, there were only 12 of them. Most of them were old people, but there were also 2 young people mixed in. The 2 young people were a man and a woman, but they weren't the twin holy knights that the Holy Church was promoting. Instead, they were a pair of younger men and women. Dake didn't know much about them, but Eve and Erin clearly knew about them. Seeing that he was interested in the pair, Eve said, "They are the only holy son and holy daughter that the Holy Church chose from thousands of candidates after the war ended." "Only?" Aurora asked curiously. "Can there be multiple holy sons and holy daughters of the Holy Church?" Eve smiled. "Didn't I say before? The current Pope was the first holy son of the Holy Church before he became the Pope. If there is a first, there will naturally be a second. The saint had always had many saints, and the same went for saintesses. As long as the holy sons and holy daughters are qualified, they will have a chance to be promoted. And every holy son and bishop has the qualifications to compete for the Pope. It's actually like this?" Dake was also slightly surprised. He asked curiously, "Then what about the holy sons and holy daughters of the past?" Eve said, "They usually become elders. Of course, some will become bishops or high priests." "I see." Dake nodded. "Then tell me about those 2 people. I'm interested in them." Eve said, "These 2 people, if you want to talk about their specific origins, the Holy Son was promoted from a candidate. He was originally the 3rd son of a small noble. His background is clear. But the Holy Daughter seemed to have appeared out of thin air, and directly became a Holy Daughter, filling the vacancy for this generation." Dark nodded. "What about the specifics?" Eve said, "The Holy Son's name is Evan Pearson. He was born in the western part of the kingdom. His father is an unknown baron. His age is close to the young master's, but he was born on January 1st. He is also 13 years old this year. He is studying at the Holy Church's Mystic Institute, and has just entered the 2nd year. The Holy Daughter's name is Audrey." Dake asked, "What about her surname?" A strange look appeared in Eve's eyes. "Joan of Arc, Audrey Joan of Arc. Her surname is Joan of Arc." Dake said in surprise, "Joan of Arc, isn't that the Holy Daughter of the Battlefield's inherent title? Is she the daughter of the Battlefield's Holy Daughter?" "I don't know about that." Eve shook her head and said, "But she is 1 year younger than Evan. She will only enter the Holy Church's Mystic Institute this year." Dake said thoughtfully, "She must have extraordinary characteristics to be crowned as an official Holy Daughter before entering the school." Eve said, "We think so too, but the Holy Church has done a good job of keeping Audrey a secret. It seems that other than the Pope and the Chief Archbishop, no one knows about her specific origins and her extraordinary characteristics. After all, it is the Church. They always like to leave some things blank and let people imagine for themselves." Dake shook his head. His interest in the Holy Son and Holy Daughter stopped there. Although these 2 people were his age, in reality, there was no intersection in their living environment or learning path. They were 2 people who he didn't need to pay attention to. As for when they grew up, they might come into contact with each other. Let's talk about it when the time comes. Dake Diming's vision was not so far-sighted. It was already very difficult to just protect this 1 acre of land, okay? He turned his attention back to the projection in the square. The people of the Holy Church who came down from the carriage did not walk to the altar. Instead, they turned around and walked to the carriage in the middle. This carriage did not look different from the other carriages. However, if one looked closely, they would find that there was a pitch-black aura drifting out from the gaps of the carriage. Pope Francis St. Patricia stopped beside the 2 unicorns. He then slightly raised the God's Fury and pointed it at the carriage. Following closely behind, the 2 bishops walked out one after another. Both of them took out their magic wands at the same time and chanted spells at the carriage. A moment later, the solidified spell turned into 2 chains and directly pierced through the door and into the carriage. Then, there was a mechanical sound, and a sacred magic array appeared on top of the carriage. The 4 walls bloomed outward like flower petals, revealing the interior of the carriage. At this moment, the crowd outside St. Louis Square suddenly cried out in alarm. under the influence of the enchantment. The emotions of the people who were prone to fluctuating easily expressed the shock and panic in their hearts completely. Even in the living room of the Duke's mansion, Dake could feel the chaos. His eyes were solemn as he stared intently at the carriage. The chains of light that exuded a sacred aura were intertwined with each other. The tall person who was bound in the chains was sitting cross-legged. His dark skin exuded a luster that did not look like a dead person. His messy black hair hung down, covering his filthy face. The devil horns that extended from both sides of his head were like goat horns. The black wings that were curled up behind his back were standard bat wings. Although they had never seen the true face of the Demon King, no matter who saw this scene, they would subconsciously think that this was the Demon King. This corpse was exuding an aura of this level. This is the Demon King? Dake completely restrained his jovial mood. At this moment, his expression was also serious. The situation had developed to this point. Although he was not the mastermind, his role in it was still the most important. Before the future was written, he could not be sure if what he did was correct. Everything was still undetermined. Everything was possible. Just like the corpse in front of him. Before anyone could prove that it was dead, it could be alive or dead. The two bishops raised their wands and created more chains of light. They further bound the Demon King's corpse and lifted it into the air. Bring it. The Pope's voice was calm and powerful. The two bishops then carried the Demon King's corpse to the altar. The Pope raised the god's fury and walked in front. After a while, the group of people all arrived at the altar. The two bishops waved their wands and moved the Demon King's corpse to the center of the altar. Archbishop Norris nodded at the approaching Pope. The two leaders of the Church of the Holy Light exchanged glances before they quickly took action. This time, they did not want to put on too much of a show for the Demon King execution ceremony. They did not even bring along the scholar Abel Yerkes, who was initially used to mislead the public. They only wanted to carry out the plan step by step. Then they would let those who liked to read and comprehend it themselves. Other than Saint Evan Pearson and Saintess Audrey Jean, the other 8 bishops followed the order and walked to the 8 corners of the altar. They then each took out a magic card and activated it at the same time. The holy light from the magic card directly shot towards the 8 gems on the 8 corners of the altar. The 8 gems instantly exploded with a blinding white light and quickly condensed into pillars of light that shot straight up. The 8 pillars of light shot straight into the sky with a magnificent aura. Archbishop Norris reached out his hand and pointed. The chains of light on the Demon King's corpse suddenly opened up. The tips of the 8 chains shot towards the 8 pillars of light and coiled around them like dragons. As the 8 chains gradually tightened, the Demon King's corpse gradually floated into the air. The Archbishop also took out a magic card. After activating it, he shined it on the corpse. Instantly, 2 magic circles appeared above and below the corpse. As for the Pope himself, he only held the god's fury in his hand and stood at the front, showing the majesty of the Holy Church to the crowd. The saint and saintess were like a golden couple, standing on the left and right of the Pope respectively. Saint Evan Pearson had thick brown curly hair. His facial features were handsome, his body was thin and his expression was cold. However, it could be seen that he was actually a little nervous. After all, it was his first time attending such a grand event. It was already very rare that Evan did not wet himself on the spot. However, Saintess Audrey Jean beside him did not seem nervous at all. Audrey had long golden hair like the sun. Her skin was so white that it was sickly. The outline of her face did not have the slightest hint of childishness. Her pair of eyes shone like rubies. Blonde hair and red eyes were not common. Audrey was like a beautiful doll. Her face was expressionless and no emotions could be seen. It was as if everything that happened around her had nothing to do with her. When the crowd was unconsciously attracted by the combination of the 3, a huge magic circle suddenly lit up on the altar. A large cross made of silver slowly floated out. The aura emitted from the cross instantly attracted everyone's attention. Just by looking at it, they felt as if their whole body was being cleansed. By the time the crowd came back to their senses, the Demon King's corpse was already tied to the cross. Its arms were pulled apart, and its feet were pressed together seamlessly. Its ferocious head drooped down, allowing its long black hair to naturally fall down. Pure and holy white light shone on its body, and black smoke kept coming out of it. Above its head, the scorching sun was emitting a blazing light. Under the scorching sun, the temperature of the square continued to rise. Less than half an hour before noon, everything was ready. Archbishop Norris walked to the Pope's side and stood a little behind him. He whispered to the Pope. The Pope looked forward and his lips moved slightly. How many more are we missing? The Archbishop whispered, 2. The Pope. Then wait a little longer. After saying that, he stood there like a statue. The Demon King's corpse that was tied to the silver cross gradually rose up. Countless gazes were focused on it. The people who recalled the cruelty of the war gradually lost control. No one knew who started it, but curses poured out like rain. Some people even hugged their heads and cried bitterly. But among them, there were also people who were anxious. The Holy Church's defense was too tight. The bronze-armored knights, silver-armored knights, and golden-armored knights formed 3 impenetrable layers of defense. The most powerful Pope of the Holy Church was personally guarding the innermost layer. The remnants of the demon race who wanted to act according to the situation only felt their hands and feet turn cold. They had nowhere to go. Even if a moth flew into a flame, there had to be a path for the moth to get close to the flame. Suddenly, the bronze-armored knights at the outermost layer seemed to have received an order, and began to shrink their formation. They shrank from the edge of St. Louis Square, and in the blink of an eye, half of the square was vacated. The people who had completely lost control of their emotions rushed forward along the empty path, and instantly occupied all the empty space. They looked up at the Demon King tied to the silver cross at a closer distance. Their faces gradually turned ferocious. They wanted to eat its flesh, drink its blood, pull out its tendons, and burn its bones to ashes. On the altar, the Pope's gaze swept across the crowd. His expression became more and more serious and cold. When there was only a quarter of an hour left before noon, he suddenly stomped his magic staff and raised it high. A green flame instantly rose from the top of the magic staff. The people inside and outside the square subconsciously looked at the flame. Their emotions that had already lost control completely exploded. The hatred and anger toward the demon race and the Demon King in their hearts rose instantly. In the Pope's vision, green flames appeared above everyone's head. They burned crazily like torches. At this time even Dake, who was a screen away, couldn't help but be affected. He suddenly looked away and used the underworld spirit spell to concentrate his thoughts on a single point and completely empty his mind. The Rage +1 indicator finally stopped. Are you okay? Aurora and Panduola asked with concern. Dake lowered his head and slowly shook his head. I'm fine. I was just provoked by the god's fury, and was a little impulsive. Why did the Pope use his magic staff to provoke people's anger? Panduola saw that he was indeed fine and frowned. It can't be that he wants to use the flame of the soul to burn the Demon King's soul, right? If the Demon King's soul was so easily burned, it wouldn't have dragged on until now. Hephaestus slowly said. In fact, once the Demon King's soul is damaged to a certain extent, it will trigger a passive reincarnation mechanism. If it's instantly destroyed, its soul will be reborn in some corner of the world. Moreover, it's not like the phylactery of a lich that can be traced. Even the best diviners can't find a trace of it. Panduola was puzzled. Then what does the Holy Church want to do? As a purebred white dragon, Hephaestus's vision wasn't bad. After looking through the entire ritual, she had her own conjecture. If I'm not wrong, they want to summon the door to the underworld and banish the Demon King's soul to the underworld. Banished to the underworld? That sounds feasible. Panduola's eyes flickered as he turned to look at Dake. What do you think? Dake's expression had already returned to normal. He glanced at Fury, which had skyrocketed, and said helplessly, I'm not familiar with the underworld, but I heard that any life form that enters from outside the underworld will have their soul gradually wiped out. Unless they cross the wall of size, they won't be able to escape the laws of the underworld. Panduola was puzzled. Does that mean it's feasible? No. Dake shook his head. Like you said, if that's all they need to do, it wouldn't have dragged on until now. I'm more inclined to believe that after the Demon King's soul consciousness is banished, Some hidden mechanism will be triggered. The underworld will cut off the connection between the Demon King's soul consciousness and the real world. It will be considered dead, and a new soul will be born in some corner of the world. Panduola was shocked. Then wouldn't the Holy Church's efforts be futile? Who knows? Dake said casually. Let's just watch the show. He confirmed that his emotions were no longer fluctuating and looked at the projection again. At this moment, there was a sudden change in the crowd inside and outside the square. It wasn't that the Demon King's remnants couldn't help but attack, but that the people of the Holy Church who were mixed in the crowd had locked onto their targets and finally attacked. Irene's line of sight turned in an instant following the sudden change. Huge halos bloomed in the crowd at the same time. Those halos didn't do any damage, and were only used to clear the area. The people around were instantly pushed away. The Demon King's remnants who were disguised as humans were completely exposed. In this special place, the Demon King's remnants maintained a high level of vigilance and reacted the moment they sensed the change. However, this silence spell, that was activated almost at the same time, instantly interrupted their chanting. Although silent casting wasn't a particularly difficult technique to master, the time required to change the casting method was enough to put them in a predicament. Light elemental magic spirits emitting holy aura appeared one after another in the summoning array. The Demon King's remnants were subdued on the spot by the magic spirits in the blink of an eye. Even if some resisted fiercely, the people of the Holy Church had already deployed people with corresponding strength when they locked onto their positions. It was enough to ensure that the Demon King's remnants would be crushed in any place. The entire process was terrifyingly clean. The Demon King's remnants didn't even have the time to stir up a wave, and more than half of them were subdued by the Holy Church. The Demon King's remnants who were still hiding forced themselves to calm down after witnessing this scene, and broke free from the trend of moths darting into the flame. They quickly disguised themselves as panicked ordinary people, and didn't dare to reveal any traces. The Pope on the altar looked down at the bustling crowd and finally said, "Bring them up." Upon hearing the order, the people of the Holy Church immediately brought the subdued Demon King's remnants to the altar. The Pope said slowly, "The embers of the Demon King's flames have been cleaned up. The execution ceremony is about to begin. The era of the Demon King shall end completely with this as the boundary. Humans shall prosper forever." He abruptly raised the god's wrath, and the green flames floating above countless people's heads instantly gathered and condensed into an increasingly large fireball at the tip of the god's wrath. The fireball rose high as though it was going to compete with the scorching sun. The entire square was illuminated by the green light. The Demon King's remnants were also detained. They were forced to bend their knees and kneel at the feet of the Demon King who was tied to the silver cross. The Holy Son who didn't have a strong enough will couldn't help but glance at them. A total of 99 Demon King's remnants surrounded the altar in circles. They were in place and filled in the last piece of the puzzle of the ceremony. The entire area within a radius of 10 miles underwent a drastic change, because of the completion of the ceremony. The wall of light erected at the edge of 10 miles instantly solidified, and turned into a solid wall that couldn't be entered or exited. The people's emotions also became easier to mobilize. The Pope still held his staff high and spoke loudly. His voice floated in the sky and clearly entered everyone's ears. The people gradually forgot their fear, forgot their grief and indignation, and their eyes were filled with worship for the saint. The Pope was immersed in the people's cries. When it was 12 o'clock in the afternoon, he softly shouted, "The time has come, light the fire." At that moment, the magic array under the Demon King's feet burst out with an extremely strong light. The sunlight within a radius of 10 miles suddenly converged and condensed into an extremely small area around the altar. The inside of the barrier instantly became pitch black, and the altar seemed to become the only stage. The sunlight gathered into a beam of light, and shone down from the Demon King's head. And under the Demon King's feet, an extremely strong flame also burst out. The Demon King who was tied to the cross was surrounded by flames. The crowd clustered around him, and let out fanatical cries. This scene was just like the first witch's hunt. Compared to humans, the Demon King was originally a latecomer. The Pope's calm voice formed an extreme contrast with the fanaticism at the scene. Human civilization existed thousands of years ago. At that time, there were no demons in the world. Whether it was the ferocious and bloodthirsty demons, or the pretentious and elegant vampires, they were still gnawing on tree bark in some unknown corner. Until the first witch, the sinner who danced with the demons, appeared. She stole human civilization. Let the demons smell the scent of flesh and blood. Let the vampires be born from corpses, and let evil spread throughout the land. She was the root of all evil, the beginning of countless evil. But later, she was burned to death by us. The green flame of the god's fury turned red. The Pope gently shook his magic wand, and a huge fireball shot into the sky. Suddenly, a cloud of fire spread out, surrounding the altar and covering the square. Now we have defeated the Demon King and let the evil bury the earth again. But everything is not over. As long as the Demon King still exists, the Demon King will not die. Our followers could not sleep every day, desperately trying to think of a way to completely kill the Demon King. Therefore it took a whole 10 years and finally, scholar Abel Yerkes created a way to kill it. In the past, the first witch was burned to death by us. Today the last Demon King will also be burned to death by us. The Pope took a step forward, and a sacred and magnificent aura burst out from his body, making him as great as a giant. And the crowd, who were guided by his words, suddenly shouted after a moment, "Burn him! Burn him! Burn him!" The angry roars turned into angry waves. The remnants of the Demon King hidden among them were fierce. The evil cults did not dare to make a sound. The 99 remnants of the Demon King on the altar gritted their teeth and roared, but it was no use. The praying of the priests became louder and louder. The flame under the Demon King's feet seemed to be affected by these countless beliefs, and it suddenly rose to more than 10 meters, completely surrounding the corpse. The people's mood became more and more excited. The Pope slightly raised his head, squinting at the sky. The Demon King's corpse was burned by the flame of the ritual, and scorched marks appeared. His skin was ignited, and his bones began to heat up. His hair ignited with flames. After a quarter of an hour of burning, the surface of his corpse was covered with flames, and a human-shaped black fog suddenly rushed out from the top of his head. The appearance of the human-shaped black fog made the people below the square even crazier. The 99 remnants of the Demon King on the altar struggled violently. The rest of the Demon King hidden in the crowd, and the evil cults with the Demon King, as the core finally could not hold back. But the chief archbishop, Caleb Norris, suddenly pulled out a magic card from his left sleeve. Holy flames rushed out from the card, and in an instant, it turned into a burning chain of light, tightly binding the human-shaped black fog. Ah! The black fog let out a terrifying scream, violently struggling. "Burn him to death! Burn him to death! Burn him to death!" The people's shouts became even crazier. The flames rushed up, burning it up. The black fog bathed in the light of the sun, and had nowhere to hide. It struggled, twisted, and roared. But the flame of the ritual burned brighter and brighter. Dake sat in the living room, looking at the projection on the wall, but only felt that this scene was exceptionally terrifying. For a moment, people couldn't tell whether the burning corpse was evil, or the person hosting the ritual and shouting, "Burn him to death" was evil. Perhaps the calm spectators of the witch's hunt, a few centuries ago, would also feel this way. The history of the struggle between the Demon King and the humans could be traced back to a very long time ago, and the real history had long been buried by the dust of time. No one knew what the truth was. The victors were writing the epic of the victors. The losers were recording the sophistry of the losers. From the standpoint of today's people, they could only look at it from their own narrow point of view. What is the black fog that came out of the Demon King's body? The disadvantage of not being present at the scene was revealed. Dake couldn't rely on his perception to tell, so he could only ask. "It's a soul." Professor Earbook gave an answer that he didn't expect. "I originally thought." Dake couldn't help but hesitate. Professor Earbook said solemnly, "At first I also thought that it wasn't the Demon King's soul, but it seems it is indeed the Demon King's soul." Little Lily said decisively, "I've seen it before." Why was the Demon King's soul still in his corpse? Dake, who had received confirmation, was momentarily stunned. He immediately thought of words like forged and split, but in the end he couldn't be sure. But at this moment, Professor Kazair said in a deep voice, "The Holy Church is conducting a reverse refinement." As the only remaining master alchemist and a professor of introduction to magic, no one present had a deeper understanding of magic than him. His words were full of confidence. Dake instantly thought of it, and then he couldn't help but reveal a look of horror. Before this, he would never have thought that the Holy Church would think of reverse refining the Demon King's soul from his corpse. Are they relying on the Great Prophecy spell? But even the Great Prophecy spell can't create something out of nothing. Is it because the Demon King's soul is actually just reincarnated and hasn't really died? But what's the point of doing this? To create two Demon Kings? Or to kill them after refining them? Does the new Demon King's soul not have the ability to reincarnate? Countless thoughts flashed through Dake's mind in an instant. Based on the current situation, assuming that the Pope and the Archbishop were mentally normal humans, then it could only be concluded that the new Demon King's soul doesn't have the ability to reincarnate, which was why they could achieve the operation of killing it after refining it in reverse. But in the end, what kind of person could come up with this kind of NT operation? Dake was shocked, but he also faintly admired it. The person who could come up with this kind of NT operation must be a genius. Even if the Demon King's soul that was refined in reverse was incomplete, or it was just a shell that made it more conspicuous. But as long as it was indeed the Demon King's soul, it would definitely not be exposed. After all, the Demon King's incomplete soul could be explained by the unimaginable torture it endured. And this ritual that imitated the witch's hunt, on the surface would also give people the perception of rules. The Demon King's soul was bound by these rules and couldn't escape, at least on the surface. Because in fact, only the internal members of the Holy Church had the deepest understanding of the Demon King's immortality. Perhaps even the remnants of the demon race didn't understand it as well as the Holy Church. In fact, they couldn't be sure whether the Demon King would die or not. In this case, if the Demon King was killed in front of everyone, they would have to believe it even if they didn't want to. After that, even if someone appeared with the Demon King's name, there wouldn't be that kind of deterrence. Or it could be said that it had nothing to do with the Holy Church. Dake calmed down and continued to watch. The Demon King's soul was bound by the chains of light, burned by the holy fire, and clamped by the ritual's rules. But all of this wasn't enough. Just as Hephaestus had expected, the Holy Church began to summon the gate of the underworld after that. Although the time was just right, the best time to summon the gate of the underworld should be at dusk. But the Holy Church didn't really want to summon the gate of the underworld. The danger they had to bear was too great. Therefore, they only wanted to summon a door frame, and then use the suppression of the noon sun to prevent the strangeness of the underworld from seeping out. The world of the living and the dead was separated by a wall. After the twilight of the gods, before the real death, the living would never be able to understand the world of the dead. Even with the Holy Church's heritage, they knew that the underworld was ominous. They only touched on some clues of the underworld through the remnants of the ancient books. But even so, it was enough to make them strictly guard against it. However, human curiosity was boundless. What they did today, while borrowing the name of the underworld, also had the idea of touching the underworld. Archbishop Caleb Norris had turned to face the altar and personally presided over the ritual. With the help of the other 8 bishops, he successfully came into contact with the underworld at 12:43 p.m. Then he quickly took out 5 magic cards and activated them one by one. Every 6 seconds, a beam of light shot into the sky. 4 beams of light turned into 4 points. The last beam of light hit the center directly. The door formed by the light appeared in the air. Gate of the underworld open. There was no announcement, no explanation, only action. When the gate that emitted the aura of nothingness slowly opened in the air, the remnants of the demons who were ready to make a move just now were all frightened. The demons' understanding of the underworld was slightly better than humans. That was why they were more in awe. But the appearance of the gate of the underworld made them feel an unprecedented sense of urgency. It was as if everything would end if they didn't make a move. We can't wait any longer. The expression of an old woman who had been shouting, "Burn him to death," suddenly changed. His skin cracked inch by inch, and the fake flesh exploded instantly. A short, old, thin demon rushed out of the crowd, and a square of black light lit up from his chest. That black light covered his whole body in the blink of an eye, condensing into a pitch-black armor covered with dense scales. The old demon who had successfully completed armor transformation burned with blazing demon flames all over his body. Amidst the exclamations of the people around him, he flew up and headed straight for the altar. On the other side, a huge sacrificial summoning array suddenly appeared. The Minotaurus, which was more than 10 meters tall, rushed out of the sacrificial summoning array, and its violent aura blew away the surrounding humans instantly. Amidst the panicked screams, this magic elf, which was at least at the 3rd rank, held a giant axe upside down, strode forward with its pillar-like legs, and charged toward the altar. And in the sky, another summoning array appeared. The remnants of the demons who had already prepared the sacrificial offerings performed the sacrificial summoning at the same time. Magic elves emitting powerful auras rushed out of the sacrificial summoning array, and amidst their roars and screams, they launched a terrifying attack on the altar. The frenzied atmosphere disappeared instantly, and panic spread rapidly. But the Pope on the altar did not move at all. He narrowed his eyes and looked down. The paladins, who had been ready for a long time, immediately raised their spears and charged toward the magic elves. In this St. Louis Square, during the Demon King execution ceremony, the battle between the remnants of the demons and the paladins finally began. The situation was not as one-sided as most people imagined. The remnants of the demons were unexpectedly powerful. The old demon who had used armor transformation was obviously the strongest of the strong. His powerful body, which was originally comparable to an 8 or 9-star magic elf, had received a huge boost after armor transformation, giving him a terrifying brute force that could tear a giant dragon apart with his body. After he jumped up from the ground, he rushed over like a ball of demon flames, instantly breaking through the obstruction of the bronze-armored paladins and silver-armored paladins, and rushed to the front of the Pope. A golden-armored paladin suddenly jumped up and blocked the old demon. "Get lost!" the old demon roared, and the raging demon flames that erupted from his body instantly engulfed the paladin. But the chest of the golden-armored paladin lit up with a square light, and a magic card was activated. A spherical shield erupted from the body of the golden-armored paladin, and instantly dispersed the demon flames. But in this short period of time, the old demon had already rushed to the front of the Pope. The Pope tilted God's fury, and the magic power surged. Just as the two sides were about to clash, there was a sudden clap of thunder from the side. Several 3rd-rank magic elves turned into beams of light and rushed into the sky, and a sacrificial summoning circle that covered the sky appeared in the clouds. Under the tumbling clouds of fire, a giant foot burning with demonic flames stepped out. The priests looked at each other, and immediately released a halo with a large range, pushing all the humans in the square back. Then the archbishop sneered and turned around to summon. The sound of prayer from the bottom of the altar changed, and a sacred and majestic divine song reverberated in the air. Pure white feathers scattered in the air, and a holy aura filled the square. A huge summoning circle lit up above the archbishop's head, and a holy aura with a trace of divinity gushed out. Above the summoning circle, a snow-white ring appeared. It was the angel's ring. Is he going to summon an angel? Dake watched nervously, but at the same time, he felt a trace of excitement. He had already seen the fairy beast, and now he really wanted to see what the angel summoned by the archbishop looked like. It was a pure and beautiful appearance like a woman. Or was it like the beast form recorded in some mysterious ancient books? But after the angel's ring, what appeared from the summoning circle was neither a human nor a beast, but a mechanical creation. A steel-type mechanical type. A light-type angel type. A creature formed by the combination of the two appeared in everyone's sight. An 11-star magic elf. God-made angel. 5-in-1-1-0-5-0-0 plus 123 plus/233. Happy Dragon Boat Festival. There are less than 100 chapters left, yay. Today's next goal is O asterisk greater than over equal to asterisk slash take out the rice dumplings tickets. Asterisk for all, asterisk for all, asterisk for all. Chapter 511. Under the huge angel ring, there was a mechanical creation made of countless gears. The overall outline of the angel of God was like a gigantic cicada. 2 gemstones that looked like compound eyes were embedded in the gears in its eye sockets. Behind it was a silver-white gear that was larger than its body, slowly rotating. This was definitely not the angel that people had in mind. Its appearance did not cause people to be fanatical about their faith. But this did not hinder its strength. After the archbishop summoned the angel of God, he stood there with ease, obviously full of confidence. Almost at the same time, the gigantic foot that stepped out of the summoning array stomped on the ground. As the earth trembled, the magical elf summoned by the remnants of the demons finally revealed itself. Its appearance was like the most standard demon, with the head of a goat and the claws of a beast. Its body was wrapped in pitch-black demon flames, and its size was much larger than the similarly tall Minotaurus. It was a full 20 meters tall. The appearance of such a gigantic and terrifying demon brought unprecedented fear to the people. Remember the website, VIP can't you? 6. Furthermore, their emotions were affected by the enchantment, making them easy to change. This was a completely different concept from the magical elves that were usually seen in the dueling arena. No matter how powerful the fiends that appeared in the dueling arena were, they would not want to harm the audience. But this great demon in front of them reminded them of the terrifying existence of the demons. The crowd that was pushed away by the priest's halo screamed in extreme fear. But even that fear was burned as part of the ritual. Flames spurted out from the tip of the god's wrath staff and turned into a gigantic burning hand that grabbed the armor transformation. Elderly demon. The Pope looked coldly at the elderly demon, that should be considered a powerhouse among the remnants of the demons. Even in the past, there was a gap in strength between the two sides, let alone now. The elderly demon could increase his strength by researching magical technology, and as the Pope, it was impossible for him to stay in the same place. That gap would only grow bigger and bigger. Under the incredulous gaze of the elderly demon, the armor on his body began to disintegrate. And after losing his armor, it was difficult for him to reach the heights of the Pope. The spear of the golden-armored paladin attacked like a dragon, and the lightning released from the tip of the spear was dazzling. When the old demon was knocked to the ground by the golden-armored holy knights, the Pope no longer looked at him. The biggest drama of this ceremony, the battle between the demon and the angel, was being played out. The gigantic gear floating behind the angel of God rotated at an extremely slow speed, and the malevolent and terrifying great evil demon was suddenly enveloped in white light. Its huge body instantly stopped moving. Even if it roared madly, it could not break free from the binding of light. The archbishop sneered and raised his hand. Sentence. The gigantic gear behind the angel of God suddenly rotated to the next level. The angel's halo above his head immediately released ripples after ripples. Within his eyes, a scarlet light rapidly condensed. 2 red lights burst out from the gem-like eyes, twisting and twisting in the air, forming a terrifying spiral beam. The great demon, who had just been summoned and had yet to display its power, had its head pierced through by the spiral beam. The demon race has long since left the stage of this era. No one can stop the Demon King's execution. The Pope's voice spread throughout the enchantment like magic, causing the people who were dominated by fear to gradually calm down. The door to the underworld completely appeared in the sky. A strange aura permeated the air. The violently struggling Demon King's soul screamed as it was sucked toward the door that exuded the aura of nothingness. It was as if as long as the black fog was sucked in, the Demon King would die completely. The remnants of the demon race who had foreseen this scene roared furiously and charged forward, but they were like moths to a flame. The knights of the Holy Church firmly controlled the situation. The angels killed the demon. Seeing that the Demon King's death was irreversible, the remnants of the demon race could not help but have thoughts of retreating. However, since they had chosen to come out of the black fog, they could not easily retreat. Regardless of whether this ceremony could achieve the desired effect of the Holy Church, what awaited them was an endless pursuit. "It's almost over," Miss Plant, who had joined in the middle of the movie, said with some regret. She seemed to be disappointed because the remnants of the demon race were too weak to withstand a single blow. Sage Cyrus also agreed. "These remnants of the demon race are too impulsive." "Whose side are you on?" Dake couldn't help but roll his eyes. Of course, his feelings were similar to Ms. Plant's. Perhaps this was the perfect example of watching a show without thinking too much. What a farce. In the tea house, Professor Earbook shook his head slightly. Only little Lily's eyes flickered slightly as she kept looking for a certain butterfly in the crowd. "Found it." Suddenly, her eyes lit up as she saw a small butterfly slowly flying out from behind the altar. Then, she immediately pulled a long face to prevent her expression from being noticed. The small butterfly blended perfectly into the environment. Even the bishops on the altar did not notice its existence. In the entire St. Louis Square, apart from Lily, who was also a fairy, even the half-fairies did not notice it. However, in the living room of the Duke's mansion, Dake suddenly showed a surprised expression. Irene did not notice the small butterfly's existence, but her vision was always locked in the direction of the altar. When the small butterfly flew into her vision, although she did not notice it, it was clearly displayed on the projection. And through the screen, the unique ability of the fairies to eliminate their presence was obviously weakened. Dake suddenly noticed the small butterfly and said in surprise, "Why is there a butterfly there?" Everyone in the living room subconsciously focused their attention. And through Eve's cognition, Irene finally discovered the butterfly's existence. But at that moment, the small butterfly that did not have a presence slowly flew to a corner of the door frame of the gate of the underworld. Fairies were sometimes as timid as mice, and sometimes as daring as the heavens. It usually depended on how curious they were about something. Novel things could give them unimaginable courage. The appearance of the gate of the underworld undoubtedly made Didi Maxiway more daring. After turning into a butterfly, she quietly approached the door frame of the gate of the underworld. Is this the legendary gate of the underworld? She used her antennae to touch the light emitted by the gate of the underworld. After a while, she suddenly frowned in her heart. Wait, the gate of the underworld is not open? The Demon King's soul was being sucked into the gate of the underworld. Could it be that even that was only the appearance of the ritual? Didi looked at the gate of the underworld that was not actually open. The butterfly's antennae kept trembling. In the living room, Dake and the others stared at the small butterfly's movements. They were curious why this butterfly was not discovered by anyone and pondered about what it wanted to do. Suddenly, Dake seemed to have thought of something and stared at the butterfly's wings. The unique patterns on the butterfly's wings were gradually overlapping with a certain scene in his memory. This butterfly, could it be Professor Didi? When the spiritual light flashed, he suddenly cried out in surprise. Almost at the same time, the small butterfly that was controlled by curiosity suddenly raised its antennae and slowly pierced into the door of the gate of the underworld. The fluctuation of magic instantly spread out. The gate of the underworld was poked with a very small, needle-like hole. But even such a small hole connected the underworld and the real world. A terrifying suction force suddenly erupted from this small hole. The terrifying suction force had no effect on physical objects, but it would pull all souls into it. Didi Maxiway's heart tightened. Without hesitation, she flapped her wings and fled this place. Her speed was as fast as lightning, but her aura was exposed along with the explosion of magic. The Demon King's soul was truly sucked into the hole, and the aura of the underworld leaked out from it. The Pope and the Chief Archbishop who were watching below the stage suddenly turned their heads the moment the gate of the underworld was pierced. The two of them who had maintained a calm expression from the beginning to the end finally had a change in their eyes. "Caleb," the Pope said in a deep voice. Archbishop Caleb Norris immediately turned to face the altar. He raised his magic wand and aimed at the gate of the underworld. But in just a moment, the Demon King's soul was completely sucked into the underworld. No matter what their real purpose of refining the Demon King's soul was, or what their other purpose was, it was too late. And the aura of the underworld or some kind of substance, had already leaked out from the hole. The archbishop repaired the small hole as quickly as possible. Then he suddenly pointed his magic wand and aimed it at the butterfly transformed by Didi Makeseaway. But the moment the magic light lit up, he had to put down his hand. Then he turned back with a dignified face and shouted angrily, "As you can see, the Demon King has been completely burned to death. His filthy soul will linger in the land of the dead forever, unable to sleep in peace." Just as the Pope said, the era of the Demon Clan has completely ended. Long live the human race. 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 The people who had witnessed the death of the Demon King with their own eyes followed the Archbishop's call and shouted. The remnants of the Demon Clan who had lost their momentum began to flee frantically. But the Holy Church had already set up an inescapable net, capturing or killing these remnants of the Demon Clan on the spot. For today's matter, the Holy Church had thought a lot. Naturally, it also included the possibility of the return of the Demon King. On the one hand, they wanted the Demon King who had returned to be regarded as a fake Demon King. On the other hand, they wanted to make him have no soldiers available so that he would not be able to do anything in the short term. In this way, the Holy Church would have more time to calculate and search for traces of the Demon King. Of course, it was in the name of eliminating the remnants of the Demon Clan. The appearance of these remnants of the Demon Clan not only gave them the excuse to launch the demon hunt, but also made the people of the kingdom realize that there were still remnants of the Demon Clan. An appropriate amount of fear and threat would make people more devout of their faith in the Holy Church. Looks like it's really over. Although the appearance of Didi Makeseaway had caused a small interlude, but the entire Demon King execution ceremony still came to an end according to the Holy Church's arrangements. The loss was nothing more than the Demon King's soul that had been refined in reverse. But for the Holy Church, who was eager to cover up the Demon King's escape, this level of loss was almost equivalent to zero. The kingdom's residents and subhumans who had come from all over the kingdom could be considered to have finished watching this scene of the year. It was not a problem to say that it was a worthwhile trip. In addition, the harvest was also innumerable. The kingdom's Ministry of Security had done a lot of things during this period of time, especially a thorough cleanup of the evil sects that had become more active recently. Although they were as difficult to burn as weeds, the fact that the Demon King was dead would cause a large number of evil sects to lose their backbone. After this, the kingdom would inevitably usher in a long period of peace and stability. This was more beneficial than harmful to the kingdom's development. Finally, Yvette and Claire did not work in vain during this period of time. Dak Diamond, on the other hand, also spent a happy weekend. I'm a little unsatisfied. I thought something more exciting would happen, like something big that would force me to walk out of the Duke's mansion. But there's not a single one of them. Dake looked at the bishops who were moving the Demon King's body into the carriage through the projection, and touched his chin. You don't have a beard. What are you touching? Panduola touched his chin. Dake blushed and quickly moved away. Aurora glanced at him and clenched her fingers. Dake. While Dake was thinking about what to do next, Professor Kazair suddenly called out to him. Dake quickly asked, "What's wrong, Professor?" Kazair took a deep breath and said, "I might not be able to teach you the transformation spell for the time being." Dake observed Professor Kazair's expression through Irene's vision and smiled gently. "It's okay, Professor. I can ask Claire for help, and I'm not in a hurry." Professor Kazair said regretfully, "I wanted to check if you were too relaxed this summer." Dake's eyelids twitched and he quickly changed the topic. "What about Professor Shi Erfu and Professor Li? Lily naughtily stuck out her tongue and said, "Hee hee." Professor Shi Erfu said helplessly, "Although I want to visit you, I can't just let them run around. I can only visit them next time." Dake said regretfully, "That's true. Then I can only wish you all the best." Professor Shi Erfu smiled and said, "Thank you for your auspicious words." Although he didn't say it explicitly, they were obviously going to find Didi Makeseaway. When Dake recognized that the butterfly was Professor Didi, he more or less expected this result. He wasn't surprised. He just felt a little regretful. Everyone had their own standpoints, and the things they saw from their own standpoints were not the same. But the one who made the choice was ultimately himself. Irene, I'll observe for a while longer. You should come back. Okay. Irene turned her head and looked out the window. After the scene changed, Dake suddenly froze. There seemed to be a change in St. Louis Square. 2 and 1 4,000 plus. Oh, greater than over equal to mouth oh. Chapter 512. Eve, zoom in a little. Eve processed the information in her mind and quickly zoomed in on the image in her eyes. Even though the clarity had decreased a lot because of this, the expression of the image had become stronger. The first to appear in the projection were the two bishops who looked flustered. In front of them was the carriage in which the Demon King's corpse had just been placed. Now, everyone in St. Louis Square knew that it was a corpse. Just a while ago, Dake saw the two bishops moving the Demon King's corpse into the carriage with his own eyes. But now there was obviously an unforeseen event. The two bishops stared intently at the interior of the carriage. One of them dashed into the carriage while the other turned around and walked toward the Pope and Archbishop. Shortly after, the Pope and Archbishop who received the news strode over with grim expressions. Then, a group of people surrounded the carriage and whispered to each other, trying their best to conceal the panic in their eyes. Remember, https://m, VIP can't you? VIP. Even though they couldn't see the interior of the carriage, they could roughly guess the situation. Could it be? They couldn't help but guess. In the tea house, little Lily poked his head out of the window and said excitedly, "It's gone, it's gone." "What's gone?" Professor Earbook asked with knitted brows. Lily looked around with shifty eyes as though he had found a little secret. He whispered, "The Demon King's corpse is gone." Everyone widened their eyes abruptly. No one doubted the little fairy's words. If the Demon King's corpse had suddenly disappeared in the carriage, it would explain why the bishops were panicking. Even though the corpse didn't seem to be of much use now. But this group of people who presided over the ceremony knew that the Demon King's soul still existed in a corner of the world. But who could steal the corpse from under the Pope's nose? Aurora asked in astonishment. Could it be the remnants of the demons? Or those secret cults? It was a pity that no one could answer her question, because even the Pope and Archbishop who were involved were baffled. Even the Pope, who had maintained a dignified expression from beginning to end, couldn't help but twitch the corner of his mouth. However, during this special period of time, he could not fly into a rage and order people to investigate quickly. Thus, Dake and the others watched as they quickly separated and boarded the carriages as if nothing had happened. Then, they urged the pure white unicorns to activate their powers and spread their wings on both sides of the gilded carriages. Under the collective gazes of the crowd, the carriages soared into the air and gradually disappeared from the direction they came from. Few people knew that the carriage in the middle, which was used to transport the Demon King's corpse, was already empty. As the saying goes, everyone has their own strengths and specializations. At this moment, even Arvette and Claire only sensed the abnormality, but they couldn't penetrate the enchantment of the carriage like the fairies and see the emptiness inside. In the eyes of most outsiders, this Demon King execution ceremony was an unprecedented success, even though they couldn't be sure that the immortal Demon King had really been killed. But since the saint had already said so, he decided to believe it for now. Anyway, the Demon King's corpse had been hidden in the seal by the saint for so many years and nothing had gone wrong. No matter how bad one's impression of the saint was, it was undeniable that the saint had a very deep foundation. Therefore, under normal circumstances, one could take today's event as the truth. What followed would naturally be a celebration of the Demon King's death. At this moment, people from all over the world had gathered in the imperial city. These people were natural tourists and consumers. If they didn't ruthlessly rip them off, no, ruthlessly welcome them, how could they express the enthusiasm of the imperial city? Therefore, as the Pope and the others left, the priests of the saint began to instruct the knights to dismantle the altar and clean up the traces. People rushed to various places of consumption in a rush. A carnival was inevitable. Convene the Holy Court Conference. As soon as he left the sight of the crowd, Pope Francis St. Patricia immediately took a quick-acting pill to calm his emotions as soon as possible. As he grew older, his rapidly aging body made it difficult for him to control his emotions as easily as when he was young. This Demon King execution ceremony, which seemed to be an unprecedented success in the eyes of outsiders, was originally held under tremendous pressure. Now the overall progress of the ceremony seemed to be smooth, but there were two huge loopholes in the key areas. First was the opening of the door to the underworld. Although it was only a small hole the size of a needle's eye, the Demon King's soul, that they painstakingly cultivated, was sucked into the underworld. The consequences of this were unpredictable. Moreover, the short connection between the underworld and the real world would bring about huge problems in itself. No one knew what strange things leaked out from the underworld during that period of time. Dealing with these strange things was within the scope of the saints' duties. The severity of this matter even made them unable to investigate the loss of the Demon King's soul. As for the second loophole, in a sense, the theft of the Demon King's corpse was more infuriating than the loss of the Demon King's soul. This was not only a serious provocation to the saints' authority, but also a serious blow to the current situation. After all, the Demon King's soul was a reconstructed fake. On the surface, it should have been disposed of, but the Demon King's corpse should have been preserved by the saint. If someone investigated, they wouldn't be able to produce a second corpse. But the above matter was actually just a one-sided problem for the saint. The real problem was that the Demon King's corpse was essentially a huge demon race gene storage. Although the saint didn't call it that internally, but it couldn't change this fact. The immortal Demon King had tens of thousands of vessels. And every time he created a vessel, he would be able to obtain the talent of this vessel. For example, after making a vampire into a vessel, he would have the ability of the embrace. Using this, he had almost integrated all the bloodlines of the demons. Although part of the bloodline couldn't be activated, it would always exist in the corpse. This meant that almost all the bloodlines of the demons could be separated from the Demon King's corpse. To the saint, the loss of the Demon King's corpse was probably countless times more serious than the matter of the Demon King's reincarnation. If the Demon King's corpse couldn't be recovered as soon as possible, it was very likely that the next time this corpse was seen, there would be a large number of demons that should have been completely extinct around it. There were tens of thousands of types of demons. It wasn't that the greater the power, the more difficult it was to deal with. Some demons with special bloodlines possessed unimaginable power. In order to deal with those demons, humans had paid an extremely heavy price. No one wanted to face them again. For this reason, the convening of the Holy Inquisition was imperative. The so-called Holy Inquisition was slightly different from the more famous Heresy Trial Conference and Holy War Guidance Conference in the Saint. It was a meeting that was even more secretive and stricter than the others. After discovering that the Demon King had escaped, the Pope had convened a Holy Inquisition conference. But he didn't expect another wave of trouble to arise. In just a few months, he was forced to convene a second Holy Inquisition conference. The Pope crushed the wine glass in his hand. Dake and the others, who didn't know much about the severity of this matter, began to discuss excitedly after discovering that the Demon King's corpse had been stolen. Due to the crowded crowd downstairs, the three professors hadn't left the tea house yet. Together with Irene, they set up a small enchantment to prevent eavesdropping and express their opinions on this matter. The topic mainly revolved around, who did it? So it wasn't Professor Didi who did it this time? Dake was very surprised. He thought that other than fairies and cats, no other life in this world would seek death like this. No. Lily shook his head like a rattledrum. Dake couldn't help but say, but if it wasn't Professor Didi who did it, who could it be? The others were also quite puzzled. Indeed, there aren't many people who can steal a corpse under the Pope's nose. Lily continued to shake his head. I don't know. Anyway, it wasn't Didi. Everyone looked at each other, not knowing what to do. In the end, Professor Earbook could only say, forget it. Tracing the traces and finding the real culprit is what the church should do. We don't have a head or tail, so it's hard to guess. Unless they let us check the carriage, but that's obviously impossible. Then let's stop here. Professor Kazair pushed his chair away and stood up. It'll be too late if we don't leave now. That's right. Lily quickly stood up as well. Then let's go. Professor Sheerfa sighed helplessly and looked into Aaron's eyes. If this is over and we're still in the royal city, we'll pay a visit to the Duke's mansion. You must come. Dake put away his expression and said seriously. Bye-bye. Lily came over and grabbed his hand. Then, Professor Kazair removed the barrier, and the three professors left quickly. What a pity. Dake shook his head slightly and said to Aaron, You should come back soon. Without the professors around, that place isn't safe. Understood. Aaron nodded slightly, paid the bill, and left immediately. The Demon King's corpse that disappeared mysteriously gave off a feeling that things were far from over. When Aaron returned to the Duke's mansion, it was already evening. Not only was she safe and sound, but she also brought a lot of souvenirs. Dake wasn't interested in the souvenirs at first, but when he saw a toy Demon King with a sword in its chest, he couldn't help but reach out his claws. The merchants were surprisingly creative, and many of the souvenirs were very good. Even if he didn't need them, he could give them to the magic elves as a reward. Seeing Ms. Cook come back, Dake couldn't help but ask, Where are the students? Ms. Cook said, They're probably in the classroom checking the exam questions. Checking the exam questions? What a nostalgic word. Dake smiled and asked, How was the exam? No one cheated, right? Ms. Cook touched her nose and said, Other than the secretary who tried to flip himself open to search, there were no problems. Puff! Dake held back his laughter. That's good. Do you need our help grading the exam papers? Ms. Cook said, No need. The three of us will rush it tonight and grade it quickly. Dake. So the exam results will be out soon? Ms. Cook said yes. Dake said with satisfaction, Very good. Then, we can go to class as usual tomorrow. Ms. Cook's eyes glinted and she agreed. That's right. The two looked at each other and couldn't help but sympathize with each other. The magic elves didn't come to the dining hall until mealtime, when the supervising maid reminded them. Dake was talking and laughing with the three professors in the dining hall. Seeing the little cuties come in one after another, he couldn't help but look over. Although the exam results weren't out yet, the exam scores seemed to have been imprinted on the little cuties' faces. When Fairy Evie walked into the dining hall, he had an arrogant look on his face. It was as if he was the embodiment of pride. The Dilu beast, who was holding a book, was still calm and had an inexplicable intellectual feel. Looking at the little demon beast, its two wings were down and it was flying in the air as if it was sleepwalking. Obviously, it didn't do well in the exam. Of course, it could also be that it was simply too dramatic. The vampire's daughter also had a dejected look, but the phoenix girl was still expressionless. The moon god's soul was completely indifferent. These three humanoid magic elves were supposed to be role models, but now, they were turning into bad examples. They even faintly had a terrible feeling that they were worse than trash slimes. As for the pair of idiots like the young green-eyed dragon and Snorlax, they were drooling at the delicious food on the table as soon as they came in. Dake couldn't help but touch his forehead. The magic elves' personalities were the same as their stats. They were all innate, and it was very difficult to change them. However, with Meow Meow as a successful example, it proved that education was indeed useful. He turned around and continued to exchange ideas with the three tutors. At night, the Duke's mansion gradually quieted down. Most of the magic elves who had just finished their exams didn't have the energy to study. They were thrown all over the room like praying mats. Dake stood by the window and looked at the night sky, thinking about what the so-called fire prophecy was. The room not far away was still lit. Senior Panduola was clearly not asleep. He wanted to take her out and have a good stroll around the streets of the royal city, but the current environment wasn't suitable. I wonder when Yvette and Claire will come back? As he was thinking, the door of the Duke's mansion lit up. Dake had an idea. He immediately put on his coat and prepared to welcome them. The Demon King execution ceremony had temporarily come to an end. Although the guests from all over the world hadn't left yet, the psychological pressure would definitely be greatly reduced. Yvette and Claire didn't have to do everything by themselves. There were some things that could be reported to them. This included the things that happened during the Demon King execution ceremony. He wasn't sure if Yvette and Claire had observed it. That was obviously not a small matter. 2 in 1 4,000 plus. Chapter 5:13. In the dining room of the Duke's mansion, Claire finished the dinner on her plate in an elegant manner, as she watched the conversation between Yvette and Dake. Ever since she became a temporary professor at the Shung Malian Academy last year, Dake had been able to continuously surprise her, even until today. Regarding the two discoveries he described, the first one was related to the gate to the underworld. Although they also noticed the abnormality, they couldn't tell that it was done by a little fairy. The second discovery was even more undiscovered. The Demon King's corpse was stolen right under the noses of the Pope and the others? Yvette couldn't help but exclaim. Dake nodded. Although it's a bit unbelievable, it's the truth. But since it's the Holy Church, there should be a way to trace it, right? Yvette took a deep breath and said, maybe. But someone who can steal the Demon King's corpse right under their noses won't be easy to track down. It seems that things are troublesome. Claire licked the sauce on her lips and giggled. But no matter how you look at it, it's the Holy Church's mistake, right? It doesn't matter whose mistake it is. Yvette shook her head. I thought that things would come to an end after today, but I didn't expect another wave to come. In addition to the possible impact of the temporary connection between the underworld and the present world, we might be busy again. After saying that, she looked at Dake apologetically, like a parent who couldn't accompany their child to the amusement park because of overtime. Website. https://m/vip. VIP. Fortunately, Dake wasn't a child who clamored to go to the amusement park. He deliberated. Actually, there's no need to rush. Like Aunt Claire said, the theft of the Demon King's corpse is the responsibility of the Holy Church. Since it's their problem, they should bear all the consequences. In our position, we can help, but it's not appropriate to interfere too much. This is obviously a thankless task. Yvette was startled, then sighed. That's true. Don't tire yourself out too much. Claire smiled and said, besides, even if the Demon King's body is really stolen and used by someone, what can they really do? It was not easy to extract the blood of other demons from the corpse of a Demon King. And it was even more difficult to create a new demon after extraction. The reason why the Devil King was able to reproduce so quickly was because he was the Devil King. But we all know that the real Demon King is probably still thinking, who am I? Indeed. Yvette couldn't help but pat her cheeks to relax. Let's see how the saint reacts before making a decision. That's right. Isn't it good to sit down and enjoy the show? Dake said in a relaxed manner. Yvette habitually added more burdens to her shoulders. It was the same for this Demon King execution ceremony. Since the Demon King execution ceremony was initiated by the saint, the chaos caused by the influx of people from all over the world should have been handled by the saint. But in reality, the order of the entire royal city was under Yvette's control. The Holy Church didn't even announce the ceremony to the staff in the church, let alone send people to maintain order. Under normal circumstances, both sides should work together. Dake said again, since the big things are over, let's talk about the small things. Do you still remember the Church of Knowledge? Of course, Yvette said. We even caught 6 of their elders yesterday. Dake asked curiously, how long are you going to lock them up for? Yvette smiled. I know that Aaron leaders and Aviva Julius came to find you, but they didn't commit any major crimes. According to the original plan, they can be released after today. Dake was surprised. So soon? Claire interjected. What they worship is neither an evil god nor a demon, but just some great people with academic achievements. To be honest, I'd rather see worship of great people than belief in gods. Yvette also nodded. If it wasn't for the special time, we wouldn't have caught them. You know, the saint did summon the gate of the underworld today. We just want to avoid the combined reaction that might happen because of this. Dake couldn't help but smack his lips. If Aaron leaders and Aviva Julius knew that they didn't need it in the first place, how would they react? But we need to pay attention to the person who reported them to us, Yvette said thoughtfully. Dake said, I heard from Aaron leaders and Aviva Julius that the person who reported them might be the 13th elder of the Church of Knowledge. Internal strife? Yelvet frowned. But the person who reported it is just a local wanderer. He must have been paid to do this, Claire said. In short, that person probably knew from the beginning that the saint would summon the gate of the underworld today. This isn't information that ordinary people can infer. Yelvet said. Let Chris investigate in detail. Is there anything else? Dake thought for a while and smiled. Nothing for now. Then go and have a good rest. Yelvet said gently. Don't worry too much. Your Aunt Claire and I will take care of everything. Dake replied, okay. Dake left the dining hall before their dinner ended. Then he wandered around the corridor for a while before returning to the bedroom. But as soon as he entered the room, he realized that Eve and Aaron were waiting inside. Good evening, young master. Eve placed her hand on her chest. Aaron also bowed slightly behind him. Dake looked at Aaron and said, Good evening, both of you. Which part of the information is it about? Aaron handed the information in her arms to him and said, It's about Madame Hephaestus d'Oregon. Okay. Dake received the information, placed it on the table and said with a smile, It's been a tiring day. You should rest. Wait, is there any news about the person who followed Aaron leaders and Aviva Julius? Eve blinked and said. After the two elders returned, they locked themselves in the room and took a nap. Then they began to study the questions that young master gave them. Dake asked, Didn't anyone find trouble with them? Eve shook her head and said, No. Is that so? Dake couldn't help but ponder. The 13th elder of the Church of Knowledge was indeed suspicious. But what he did to report was, in fact, correct behavior. Theoretically, there was no reason to hold him accountable. At this thought, he felt a headache coming on. In this world, most things weren't black and white. It was basically impossible to simply make a wrong judgment. After Eve and Aaron left, he picked up the information about Senior's mother and browsed through it. The Duke's mansion's intelligence-gathering ability was indeed strong. This information was enough for him to have a clearer understanding of the person, dragon, Hephaestus d'Oregon. Hephaestus d'Oregon was a pure-blooded white dragon. The so-called white dragon was simply a dragon of the light attribute. The difference between pure-blooded dragons and most non-human species was that they had the same high intelligence as humans and were highly adaptable to magic. Most pure-blooded dragons could master advanced transformation magic before they reached adulthood. Not only could this make their huge bodies smaller, but they could also transform into humans. Being able to transform into humans was the key to the intersection between pure-blooded dragons and humans. Hephaestus d'Oregon was once a dragon that served the Church of Light. The service here wasn't slavery or loyalty but doing things for money. Dragons liked gold and gems, and the Church of Light was very rich. In the later stages of the war, the dragons and the demons completely opposed each other, and joining the human army became the general trend. However, it wasn't easy to have a dragon as a mount. The pride of pure-blooded dragons, like their greed for gold, was engraved in their bones and flowed in their blood. Only the most handsome, noble, and powerful humans were allowed to be their knights. Therefore, pure-blooded dragon knights mostly had noble bloodlines, handsome or beautiful appearances, and top-notch strength among humans. It was even more stringent than choosing a national idol. There were people like that in the Saint Church. But Hephaestus d'Oregon was also a white dragon. As a dragon with the light attribute, she was of course more popular in the Church of Light than other attributes. In order to become her dragon knight, in addition to being handsome, noble and powerful, one must also have an affinity with the light attribute. There weren't many people who met the first three conditions. Plus the fourth condition. Generally, as long as there were no other problems, this type of person would be given a title. Holy Son. In other words, Hephaestus d'Oregon's knight was a Holy Son. Holy Son plus pure-blooded white dragon equals Holy Dragon Knight. Holy Dragon Knight. Roland Patricius's name once resounded through the battlefield, and became a hero of the Church of Light no less than Saint Joan of Arc. Until the dragon and the knight were secretly conceived. This. Turning to this point, Dark could almost imagine the Pope's face. The Church of Light was a firm believer in the pure-blooded humans. They opposed all foreign races and foreign hybrids. Their discrimination against subhumans was deeply rooted, and they believed that subhumans were an inferior species that only deserved to crawl under the feet of humans. Roland Patricius's actions were like stabbing a knife in the back of the Church of Light. During the war, His Holiness the Pope endured humiliation for the sake of the overall situation and didn't attack him on the spot. But after Hephaestus d'Oregon was pregnant, her strength was greatly reduced, and she couldn't even go to the battlefield when she was about to give birth. The Holy Dragon Knight no longer existed. Without a dragon, Roland Patricius, the Dragon Knight, finally fell under the concentrated fire of the demons who hated him very much. Once the knight died, there was naturally no need to continue to move to a mount. In addition, the situation of the war at that time was already tilted towards humans, and such a white dragon's combat power was no longer scarce. Therefore, according to the dogma, Hephaestus was sent to Badia prison. As for her and Holy Son Roland's child, he was thrown into the forest of exile. After reading the entire information, Dark felt as if he had just finished watching an 8 p.m. melodramatic family drama. His whole body was drained of energy. Should I blame the Church of Light for being cold and cruel? Or should I blame Holy Son Roland for not being able to control Dio? Dake reorganized the information and decided to temporarily seal this part of the memory. He didn't think that Senior Panduola wouldn't ask about her background after reuniting with Hephaestus. But today, when he watched the Demon King execution ceremony, during the day, he didn't see her and Hephaestus glare at the Pope. If he guessed a little, maybe it was because Holy Son Roland died honorably in battle and wasn't secretly harmed by the Church of Light. Or maybe it was because Hephaestus didn't suffer in Badia prison. Just like the Blood Princess, Ophelia Bullard, she also belonged to the category of people who were treated well in Badia prison. Basically, except for losing her freedom, the prison guards would satisfy most of her requests. Or maybe Senior was just more open-minded and had a more thorough study of look to the future. In short, this was their family matter. Since he was sure that Hephaestus d'Oregon wasn't a dangerous person, Dake wasn't prepared to continue paying attention. The only problem was, why did the surname Patricia sound so familiar? As Dake thought about it, his expression suddenly stiffened, and the hand holding the information trembled. Patricia, wasn't that the surname of the current pope? Of course, Pope Patricia St. Patricia was still a young man in his 30s 15 years ago. It was impossible for him to have a son in his 20s. It could only be said that the surname Patricia was indeed noble enough. If Senior Panduola wanted to, she might be able to pull out a bunch of relatives in one go. Of course she wouldn't. And a theocratic family that strictly adhered to dogma would never accept mixed blood. This could be seen from the fact that after Panduola was thrown into the forest of exile, no one cared about her. Fortunately, in the Dimming family, I am the dogma. Dake shook his head slightly and put away the information. He got up and picked up the magic elves scattered all over the place, throwing them back on the bed one by one. Then he went to bed and quickly welcomed the next day. On the day after the Demon King execution ceremony ended, Arvette and Claire returned to normal at breakfast time. At one of the 2 dining tables in the dining hall, the magic elves were uneasily handling the food on their plates, as if they were examinees waiting to be executed. At the other dining table, the 2 guests of the Duke's mansion were eating together with the host for the first time. Panduola was a little reserved, which was rare for her. She had changed into a new dress that she had bought in the city the day before yesterday. Her bangs were neatly combed, and the 2 sides of her long black hair were tied up with ribbons, reaching the sides of her ears. This rarely seen outfit made her look a little younger. The tips of her eyebrows and lips were also decorated with the help of the maid. After Dake bumped into her, he asked her in surprise which princess banquet she was attending. She said she was going to the battlefield. Aurora, who happened to hear this, was stunned for a moment before she hurriedly returned to the bedroom and changed out of her home clothes. Today, the Duke's mansion was filled with the smell of gunpowder since morning. 2 and 1 4,000 plus. Chapter 5:14. Even though Panduola had already stayed in the Duke's mansion for 2 nights, this was the first time she and her daughter were meeting the owner of the mansion. Thus, not only did Panduola dress up meticulously, but Hephaestus also changed into a relatively exquisite set of clothes. For the proud white dragon, the so-called noble bearing was nothing more than something that could be displayed with a raise of her hand. She walked into the dining hall with Panduola with a completely different temperament from 2 days ago, and gave the Duke a formal greeting. After that, Hephaestus and Yvette began to chat happily as parents of both sides. Yvette was clearly aware of Hephaestus' identity, so she didn't ask any questions. Most of the topics of their conversation were focused on their respective children, like parents who had met by chance at a parent-teacher conference. Hephaestus recounted her daughter's achievements in the academy one by one, her eyes filled with undisguised pride. Yvette didn't fall behind either as she listed all the achievements that her baby had made in the past year, competing against each other. The two who were being compared by their mothers could only helplessly sit in their seats, facing each other in silence. It didn't matter if it was out of etiquette or for some other reason. Remember the URL. VIP can't you? VIP Panduola had only wanted to leave a good enough impression on the Duke during their first meal together. She didn't expect that the one who would disrupt everything would be her mother. However, when she stole a glance at the Duke's happy expression as he chatted with her mother, she felt that this might be a good thing. At least through her mother's flaunting, her own merits were gradually being displayed in front of the Duke. Dake, who was being compared to her, was also outstanding enough. This way, the two of them would give others the feeling that they were standing on the same level. However, she didn't really care about this. The main reason she was so serious this morning was to see the Duke's attitude towards mixed bloods. It seemed that the Duke didn't discriminate against mixed bloods at all. She couldn't help but sigh in relief. As long as this fundamental problem didn't become an obstacle, other things that could be changed could always be solved. Panduola pondered as she cut the steak on the plate into small portions. The steak on the plate was very delicious, but it was a pity that from today onwards he couldn't eat to his heart's content. After all, a girl should act like a girl. Panduola, you'll be in 5th grade in autumn, right? Claire Kate's sudden words made her hand that was holding the fork tremble slightly, and the sauce on the steak stained the corner of her mouth. She stuck out her tongue and licked the sauce off the corner of her mouth. She nodded and said, "Yes." "In that case," Claire said with a smile, "in another year, you will be in the 6th grade. I remember that starting from the 6th grade, the academy requires students to determine their career path. If they have a plan, they can apply for an internship in the first semester of the 6th grade. Would you like to work for me, Professor Claire?" Panduola's eyes widened in surprise. Claire's smile was very warm. "In fact, I'm preparing to start a club of mages. The club's business will be spread across many industries. If you're willing to join, you'll definitely find something you like." Panduola looked carefully and found that Claire was very likely serious. He couldn't help but frown. "Professor, I'm still working as a librarian in the academy." Claire smiled. "Isn't there Miss Bella as a librarian? Don't tell me you want to continue working as a librarian in the academy after graduation?" Panduola. Claire was shocked. "No way." Panduola smiled helplessly. "In fact, that's what I'm planning to do. Also, working in the academy is something that every student wants to do. The academy doesn't reject having a librarian." Claire shook her head. "Staying in the academy to develop your career does have its advantages, but that's for mediocre people. With your ability, the academy will only limit your development." Panduola still shook his head. "I still want to stay in the academy." Claire frowned and thought for a moment. He probed. "You don't want to leave Miss Bella?" Panduola nodded slightly. Claire said, "I think Miss Bella wouldn't want to delay your future because of her. Also, even if you leave the academy, you can go back to see her at any time." "It's not like that." Panduola gritted his teeth and said, "Actually, I want to apply to the academy this year to give my mother a chance to interview for a magical beast professor position." Claire turned to look at Hephaestus and immediately understood. For Hephaestus Doragon, there was no safer and more stable place than the Shungmalian Academy. If she could successfully apply for a position as a professor in the Shungmalian Academy, she would have a place of refuge. If Panduola stayed as a librarian, he could always be with his 2 family members. She had just reunited with her mother, so she definitely wouldn't be able to stay for long. At this point, Claire realized that Hephaestus and Yvette had stopped talking. Hephaestus had just proudly praised her daughter, but now she was blushing. Claire thought for a moment and said, "There's no rush now. You still have a year to think about it. Maybe you'll change your mind then? Well, it's fine even if it's a few more years. As long as my community doesn't collapse, there'll always be a place for you." In the face of such a warm invitation, Panduola couldn't reject it directly, so he could only nod with a smile. Seeing that the conversation was about to end, Dake took the opportunity and said, "Aunt Claire, are you really going to set up a Magister's Society?" "Of course." Claire blinked. "When have I ever lied?" Dake could only say, "But if you set up a Magister's Society, won't your Claire's travels around the world be followed up?" Claire was stunned, but then she smiled and said, "Who told you that I can't travel and explore after setting up a Magister's Society? I'm going to include this part of my business." Dake shook his head and said, "A company with too many businesses will have a much harder time surviving. It's better to focus on a single business first, and then slowly expand. In the end, your Magister's Society still doesn't have anything, right?" Claire crossed her arms and said confidently, "Yes, it's still in the initial stage." Dake smirked and said, "Then do you have other members? You can't be the only one, right?" Claire narrowed her eyes and revealed a dangerous aura. "Why do I feel like you're provoking me?" No. Dake quickly waved his hands. "How would I dare?" "You don't dare, not you don't want to," Claire suddenly said sternly. However, before Dake could argue, she laughed to herself. "It's just an idea. I don't really want to participate in politics, and I don't want to be a freeloader in your family. In the end, after thinking about it, I'm only left with the path of entrepreneurship. Why, do you have any good candidates to recommend to me?" Dake glanced at Panduola and pointed at himself. "Look, what do you think of me?" "You?" Claire asked suspiciously. "You have a lot of ideas. But if your studies are delayed because of this, I'm afraid Yvette will skin me alive." Yvette glared at her and said, "Do I look like such a fierce person? At most, I'll pull out a few of your nails." Hiss. On the other side of the table, a few magic elves who were listening suddenly shivered and subconsciously touched their claws. Dake shrugged and said, "Actually, I'm thinking about how to start a chamber of commerce, and I already have a business plan. How about it? Won't you consider asking me to be the president?" Claire frowned slightly and said, "You really have a plan?" "Of course," Dake said seriously. "I originally planned to entrust a head maid to start the Chamber of Commerce on my behalf. But since you want to start a Magister's Guild, I won't do anything unnecessary. I'll be the president." Claire clapped her hands and said, "I understand. You want me to work for you for free." Dake smiled awkwardly. "How can that be? Who are we? Besides, what's mine is yours." Claire's lips curled up and she finally smiled. "Unfortunately, you just turned 13 this year. According to the current law, you have to be 16 years old to register for the guild. How about this? Before you become an adult, I'll reluctantly be the acting president. After 3 years, if the law hasn't changed, I'll return the position of president to you. Now, let's talk about your business plan." Dake obviously knew that he wasn't old enough. The reason why he said that was just to take the initiative. So next, he briefly explained the concept of the dual disc. Easter egg model card, dual disc, charging card, all linked together. Dake finally concluded, the biggest feature of this project is that it's universal. Even people who lack magic can use it to experience the fun of dueling. If it can be promoted smoothly, I don't need to say more about the profits, right? After listening, not only Claire, but even the others couldn't help but fall into deep thought. If it wasn't for the popularity of the model Easter egg, they might not have seen the prospects of a universal duel, because of their lack of knowledge and other reasons. But now that the model Easter egg was popular, it was easy for people to calculate the future. Not to mention, the essence of the duel card was in fact a derivative of the model Easter egg. In other words, it was a sure way to make money. If this project was the first project of Claire's Mage Society, it would definitely give the society, which currently had nothing, a very high starting point. And if they could use this as a foundation to accumulate their first fortune, then no matter what the society wanted to do, they would have enough details. The research of magic engineering was a costly matter to begin with. Dake just looked at Claire's expression and knew that she couldn't refuse. So he continued. About this idea, I've already written a detailed plan. Also, I've already reached a distribution agreement with Brown of the Eugenie Chamber of Commerce. Of course, I'll return the favor. After the meal, I'll bring the plan to you. Claire couldn't help but sigh and say, I always feel like my idea of starting a mage society is falling into your trap. This is called coincidental. Dake shook his head and said, And isn't it good to fall into my trap? Claire said dotingly, Okay. Dake couldn't help but raise his nose. Claire asked, Can I ask what the purpose of this plan is? To make money, Dake said straightforwardly. Although the Duke's residence was very rich, it wasn't inexhaustible. But the research of magic technology was a bottomless pit. Moreover, he didn't feel bad about spending the money he earned. I'm talking about other things. Claire rolled her eyes. Dake could only say, To let the whole world laugh at the duel. When breakfast was over, the magic elves left the dining hall under the guidance of the maids. Then, Arvette went to work while Claire stayed behind. Her idea of starting a mage society wasn't a joke. Otherwise, she wouldn't have tried so hard to recruit Panduola. In this era where the people were becoming more and more independent, capitalism had begun to sprout. It was because Claire noticed this that she wanted to get involved in capital and support Yvette outside of the military and politics. And the reason why she wanted the Mage Society to be the main focus was because magic technology was the future. As for who would be the president of the Mage Society, it wasn't the main point. After a while, Dake took out the proposal he had prepared and handed it to Claire. Then he felt his body relax, as if a heavy burden had been lifted off his shoulders. Although he was very interested in the proposal, a series of troublesome matters would definitely follow if he really started to set up the Chamber of Commerce. It was because he foresaw this that he prepared to let the head maid, Libra, do it. Now that he handed it to Claire, he naturally felt more at ease. After that, he only needed to communicate with the academy. Rather than doing it himself, Dake was more willing to be a hands-off shopkeeper and earn money by lying down. Panduola, Hephaestus, and even Aurora, who didn't feel like participating in the whole process, were all attracted by the proposal and gathered around Claire. Looking at their attitudes, even if they didn't want to join the Mage Society now, they most likely wouldn't be able to escape in the future. If that's the case, then after a few years, I'll change the name of Claire Archmage Society to Dark Archmage Society, and they'll be my people. Dake laughed in his heart, and then quietly slipped out of the cafeteria. After the three tutors rushed through the night, the magic elves' test papers were all marked. As a parent, he naturally had to be present and let the magic elves feel the weight of their parents' expectations, so that they could carry the burden forward. 8:30 in the morning. Apart from Camilla, the three tutors were all present. The atmosphere in the classroom was extra serious. Dake pushed open the door and entered, causing the pressure on the magic elves to increase. 2 and 1 4,000 plus. 200,000 words away from the small goal. It's time to reveal my true strength. See you tomorrow night at 12. You're tuning in to the Earbook Haven YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.